Imagine, if you will, closing your eyes and letting yourself drift across the waters of the Bosphorus on a spring night long ago. The air is soft, carrying with it the mingled scents of salt, burning oil lamps, and blossoming gardens along the hillsides. The sea reflects the shimmer of countless lanterns that gleam from towers, houses, and ships anchored in the deep harbor. Ahead of you rises a vision, an enormous city crowned by walls that stretch from sea to sea, a mighty fortress of stone that seems less built by men than carved out of time itself. This is Constantinople. For more than 1,000 years, travelers approached these waters and felt the same awe. The city of Constantine the Great, the New Rome, stood as a beacon at the crossroads of two continents. From the landward side, immense ramparts, known as the Theodosian Walls, guarded the approach. Triple lines of stone and mortar studded with watchtowers, so massive that countless armies had tested their strength and broken against them like waves on a cliff. From the seaward side, chains stretched across the entrance to the Golden Horn, that sheltered inlet shaped like a curving arm embracing the city. Behind those defenses lay a world unlike any other palaces, roofed with gleaming tiles, churches crowned with domes that soared toward heaven, bustling markets where goods from every known land were sold, and streets echoing with the chants of monks, the cries of merchants, and the songs of sailors. The Byzantines, as we call them today, simply called themselves Romans. They saw their empire not as something new but as the continuation of the ancient Roman world, a living line stretching back to Augustus and Caesar. For them, the fall of Rome in the West had not been an ending. It had been a passing storm. The true empire lived on here, in this city, at the meeting place of East and West, where Greek wisdom, Roman law, and Christian faith blended into something unique, something enduring. And as you float closer on this quiet night, you can almost sense the weight of that history pressing in on you. But history is never still. As the centuries rolled by, Constantinople became not only a jewel but a prize, a city desired by Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, Crusaders, and Turks. Time and again, enemies gathered at its gates, and time and again the walls held. To live in Constantinople was to believe in its eternity. As long as the walls stand, so will the empire, people whispered. Generations were born and died under that promise. Children played in the shadow of ancient statues. Merchants traded under the bronze horses of the hippodrome, and priests sang beneath the glittering mosaics of Hagia Sophia. The city seemed untouchable, and yet, as we begin our story of its final centuries, we must remember that even the strongest walls can crumble if weakened from within. Constantinople had faced triumphs and disasters before. It had seen emperors rise from obscurity to power, and emperors dragged from their palaces to exile or death. It had watched as fires swept through its neighborhoods, as earthquakes toppled its churches, as plague carried away thousands. Always it rebuilt. Always it endured. But by the 15th century, the empire was no longer what it had been. Once, its armies had marched from Spain to Syria, its fleets had dominated the Mediterranean, and its coffers had overflowed with the riches of the world. Now it was a fragment, a fragile shell clinging to the memory of greatness. Yet still, the city glowed with a strange, melancholy brilliance. Its markets, though smaller, still hummed with life. Its scholars, though fewer, still preserved the wisdom of Greece and Rome. Its churches, though their gold had been stripped by desperate emperors, still rang with chants that seemed to echo from another age. To walk through Constantinople in those final days was to feel at once the grandeur of the past and the fragility of the present. Every stone whispered stories, every shadow carried ghosts. Picture the dawn breaking over the Sea of Marmara. The first rays of light strike the dome of Hagia Sophia, that marvel of engineering and faith, lifting it into a golden glow. Pilgrims kneel inside, their prayers rising like smoke to the vaulted ceilings. Outside, fishermen haul in their nets, merchants set out their wares, and soldiers pace along the ramparts. Life continues, ordinary and extraordinary at once. No one knows that within a few short years, the empire will vanish forever. No one can imagine that the Roman line, which had lasted for over 2 millennia, is about to end. To tell this story is not to recount only battles and sieges, it is to wander through streets alive with voices, to sit in candlelit chambers where emperors wrestled with impossible choices, to ride with armies across mountains and plains, to kneel in churches filled with incense and song. It is to feel the heartbeat of a civilization that, even in its decline, remained luminous. And because this is a story for the quiet hours of night, let us move gently, letting each detail linger like a soft lullaby, guiding you deeper into the dream of Byzantium. We will journey across centuries. We will stand with Basil II, the Bulgar slayer, as he blinds his captives in an act both ruthless and calculated, and we will watch his empire swell to its greatest reach. We will grieve with citizens as Crusaders' supposed allies storm the gates in 1204, tearing the heart from the empire. We will follow emperors into exile, rebuilding hope in Nicaea, and we will walk beside them as they return in triumph to a Constantinople scarred but still standing. We will feel the dread as new enemies gather the Ottomans, disciplined and relentless, and we will hear the last prayers of the last emperor, Constantine XI, as he falls with sword in hand upon the walls of his beloved city. But for now, in this first chapter, let us simply linger on the image of the city itself, Constantinople, Polis ton Polion, the city of cities. Imagine walking through its markets. Spices from Arabia fill the air with warm, sharp scents. Silks from China shimmer in the light. Coins clink as merchants haggle in a dozen tongues: Greek, Latin, Arabic, Italian, Slavic. Imagine the hippodrome, once echoing with the thunder of chariots, now quieter but still a place of gathering. Imagine the imperial palace, its courtyards filled with marble statues, its halls echoing with the soft footsteps of courtiers and the whispered intrigues of politics. And imagine the people, the fisherman casting his net before dawn, the monk bent over a manuscript, carefully tracing ancient words, the noblewoman arranging her robes of embroidered silk before attending a liturgy, the child chasing pigeons across the square before Hagia Sophia. They did not think of themselves as living at the end of an age. They were simply living, laughing, working, loving, grieving within the great walls of the city that had stood for 1,000 years and which they believed would stand for 1,000 more. As you picture these scenes, let your mind drift. Let the sounds of the market fade into the chant of priests. Let the shimmer of gold mosaics soften into the glow of candlelight. Let the weight of centuries settle gently on your thoughts. You are walking now through a dream of stone and light, a city both real and mythical, a city whose story we will unfold, slowly, chapter by chapter, as night deepens and sleep carries you further into its embrace. For this is the beginning of our journey, the story of Constantinople, the last breath of Rome, the jewel of Byzantium, and the stage upon which one of history's most poignant dramas would be played. Close your eyes and imagine the year is 324 CE. The Roman Empire, that vast and restless giant, still stretches across seas and continents, but its heart is divided. Civil wars rage, rival emperors rise and fall, and the old city of Rome, itself ancient, proud, eternal Rome, has grown weary. Its temples are crumbling, its narrow streets choked, its senate shadows of what they once were. The empire needs something new, something fresh, a vision to carry it into a different age. Into this storm steps Constantine. History remembers him as the Great, and not without reason. He was a man of ambition so vast it could fill an empire, a soldier hardened by years of campaigning, and a ruler with a mind as sharp as his sword. But he was also something more, a dreamer, a man who believed the divine had touched him, guiding his steps. He would change not only the fate of Rome, but the fate of the world. Legend tells that before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, Constantine saw a vision in the sky, a cross of light, and the words, "In this sign, conquer." Whether it was a miracle, a dream, or a story woven later by those who wanted to see God's hand in history, we may never know. But what matters is that Constantine believed. He took the Christian cross as his standard, marched into battle, and won. And with that victory, Christianity, long persecuted and hounded in the shadows of the empire, found itself embraced by imperial power. Constantine did not merely allow Christians to worship freely. He began to weave their faith into the fabric of the empire itself. But Constantine's vision went further. He looked west to old Rome, filled with its crumbling monuments and tangled politics, and he looked east toward the glittering lands of Greece, Anatolia, and beyond. He saw the Bosphorus, that narrow strait where Europe and Asia meet, where trade and armies and ideas forever crossed. And there, on a peninsula guarded by seas and sheltered by harbors, he saw a new capital rising in his mind's eye. This place had once been a Greek colony called Byzantium, a modest settlement that had weathered centuries of wars. But to Constantine, it was destined to be more. Here, he would build a city not merely of stone and mortar, but of destiny, a city that would be the new Rome. Picture the scene. Workers swarm across the rocky peninsula. Foundations are laid, roads are carved, aqueducts and forums begin to take shape. Marble is hauled from distant quarries. Bronze is cast into statues. Mosaics sparkle under the hands of artisans. Constantine walks among them, cloak sweeping, eyes alight with purpose. He is not just building a capital, he is building a statement. Rome may have been founded by a wolf-suckling twin brothers beside the Tiber, but this new Rome would be founded by an emperor touched by God, crowned by victory, and guided by vision. And so in 330 CE, the city was consecrated. Constantine gave it his name, Constantinopolis, the city of Constantine. To his subjects, it was often simply the city. For centuries to come, when people said polis in Greek, there was no confusion which one they meant. It was Constantinople, the city of cities, destined to outshine even its mother Rome. From the beginning, Constantinople was more than just a seat of power. It was a bridge. Here east and west mingled. Roman law and administration flowed in, but so did Greek philosophy, Oriental luxury, Christian theology, and the wisdom of lands as far as India and China. Ships crowded its harbors bringing spices, silks, grains, and treasures. Scholars gathered in its schools. Priests filled its churches. Soldiers garrisoned its mighty walls. The city became a beating heart that pumped life through an empire that might otherwise have withered. The people felt it. Imagine being a citizen of Constantinople in those first generations. You walk down the Meze, the grand avenue that cut through the city. On either side rise colonnades and shops. Ahead stretches the great hippodrome, where the roar of the crowds during chariot races shakes the ground. Statues from across the empire stand in its plazas, bronze horses from distant lands, marble gods and emperors, treasures plundered and preserved. And, towering above all, even in its earliest days, is the emperor's palace, a complex of halls and gardens where Constantine and his successors hold court. But at the heart of the city stands something even greater. Constantine began a great church, though it would later be rebuilt into the marvel we know as Hagia Sophia. To step into such a space, even in those early centuries, was to step into another world. Candles flickered against gold mosaics. The scent of incense filled the air. The chants of priests rose like waves against the vaulted ceilings. Here the spiritual and the earthly met. Here the empire declared not only its power but its soul. Constantinople was a statement of survival. Old Rome might fade, but the empire would not. It would endure, here, guarded by seas, nourished by trade, fortified by faith. Generations grew up believing that as long as Constantinople stood, Rome itself lived on. And for more than 1,000 years, that belief would prove true. Yet, destiny is never simple. From its very birth, Constantinople attracted enemies. Its wealth was tempting, its strategic position essential. Persians, Goths, Arabs, Bulgars, all would come in time to test its strength. But those walls, Those mighty Theodosian walls, raised in the 5th century, turned the city into a fortress unmatched. Wave after wave would crash against them, and wave after wave would break. To be a citizen of Constantinople was to believe you lived in the center of the world, behind defenses blessed by God and man alike. Still, empires are made not only of walls and treasures, but of people, and the people of Constantinople were a tapestry. Greek-speaking Romans mingled with Syrians, Armenians, Slavs, Italians, and Jews. Markets echoed with a dozen languages. Food stalls sold olives, bread, fish, honey cakes. Monks in dark robes brushed shoulders with merchants in bright silks. Foreign envoys marveled at the splendor. Pilgrims wept at the relics of saints. Life in Constantinople was not always easy. Fires swept through neighborhoods. Riots erupted in the hippodrome. Emperors could be cruel or incompetent. But always, there was the sense of being part of something vast, something eternal. Constantine's dream had taken root. He could not know, as he walked the colonnades of his new city, how long it would endure. He could not know that nearly 1,200 years later, his city would still stand, battered but unbroken, the last heir of Rome. He could not know that his name would echo in the final emperor who, sword in hand, would die upon its walls. But perhaps, in his vision, he glimpsed some shadow of what was to come. For now, let us linger with him at the beginning. The emperor looks out from his palace across the Bosphorus. Ships glide through the waters, sails billowing. The sun sets, turning the domes and columns of his city to gold. Behind him rise the halls of power, before him the endless horizon. He has given his empire a new heart, and that heart will beat for more than 1,000 years. So rest with this image. The dreamer emperor, the newborn city, the promise of eternity. The stage is set, the players are gathering, and the story of Constantinople, its triumphs, its tragedies, its rise and its fall, has begun. Imagine the city Constantine built, still young, still shimmering with promise, now a century older. Constantinople has grown, its harbors overflowing with ships, its avenues thrumming with life. The walls are stronger, the palaces grander, the churches more magnificent. And upon the imperial throne now sits a man whose ambition burns hotter than any who came before him. His name is Justinian. History would call him the Great. Close your eyes and picture him. A man of humble origins from the Balkan provinces, risen by talent, determination, and perhaps a touch of destiny. He was not born into the purple. He seized it through cunning and sheer will. Beside him stands his empress, Theodora, once an actress, a woman of remarkable intelligence, fiery spirit, and unyielding resolve. Together, they would shape an empire's fate. From the moment Justinian placed the diadem upon his brow in 527 CE, his vision was clear: to restore the Roman world. The Western Empire had fallen into the hands of barbarians, Rome herself a faded shadow. But Justinian dreamed of uniting East and West, of bringing the Mediterranean once more under the eagle of Rome. It was a dream as vast as it was dangerous, a dream that would push Byzantium to the very edge of ruin and yet carve his name into eternity. But before the conquests, there was the city. Constantinople, jewel of the empire, needed to shine brighter than ever. And fate, in its strange way, gave Justinian the chance. In 532 CE, fury erupted in the Hippodrome. The Nika riots, sparked by factional disputes between the Blues and Greens, the city's racing teams turned political mobs boiled over into rebellion. For days, the city burned. The mob demanded Justinian's head. Senators plotted his overthrow. The palace shook with fear. Justinian wavered. He thought of fleeing. But Theodora, his empress, would not allow it. "Purple," she declared, "makes a fine burial shroud. Better to die an emperor than live in shame." Strengthened by her words, Justinian acted. His general Belisarius lured the rioters into the Hippodrome and unleashed a massacre. Tens of thousands were cut down where they stood, their cries echoing beneath the charioteers' statues. the rebellion was drowned in blood, and from the ashes of that destruction, Justinian built his masterpiece, Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom. Imagine its construction: teams of architects, mathematicians, and craftsmen working day and night, columns hauled from ancient temples, domes designed to defy the very laws of gravity. In less than 6 years, it rose, vast and otherworldly. Step inside and you are bathed in golden light, the dome floating above like the heavens themselves. "Solomon, I have surpassed thee," Justinian is said to have whispered upon its completion, and perhaps he was right. But Justinian's ambition did not end with churches. His armies, led by the brilliant Belisarius, marched west. North Africa fell first, the Vandals crushed in swift campaigns. Then Italy, where the Goths resisted fiercely in years of brutal war. Rome, scarred but stubborn, changed hands again and again. Belisarius, underfunded and often undermined, fought with genius. Yet the cost was staggering. Fields burned, cities starved, populations dwindled. By the war's end, much of Italy was a wasteland. Still, for a shining moment, the Roman world seemed whole again. The empire stretched across the Mediterranean, Spain's southern coast, North Africa's fertile shores, Italy's proud cities, all under the double-headed eagle. To see the maps of Justinian's reign was to glimpse Rome reborn. Yet dreams come with costs. The treasury groaned under the weight of endless wars. Armies bled the provinces dry. And worse, plague. Around 541 CE, a terrible sickness swept through Constantinople. The Justinianic plague, one of the deadliest in history, carried off perhaps half the city's population. Streets filled with corpses, trade ground to a halt, fields lay untended. Even Justinian himself fell ill but recovered. The empire survived, but it was forever weakened. And still, Justinian pressed on. He codified the laws, gathering centuries of Roman decrees and judgments into one great work, the Corpus Juris Civilis. The laws of Rome, clarified and preserved, would shape Europe for 1,000 years. He strengthened defenses, built fortresses, dug canals. He left behind not just conquests, but a vision of order, of empire, as law, faith, and majesty entwined. But for all his triumphs, Justinian could not escape the limits of power. The lands he reconquered strained under devastation. The Persians pressed hard on the eastern frontier. The plague returned, again and again. When Justinian died in 565 CE, he left an empire larger than any since the days of Rome, but also stretched thin, exhausted, and vulnerable. And yet, his city remained. Hagia Sophia shone. The Theodosian walls stood strong. Constantinople was still the queen of cities, her people proud, her emperors certain of their divine destiny. The empire would endure, as it always had, reshaped by fire, but not destroyed. Imagine now, as you drift into calm, the great dome of Hagia Sophia glimmering with candlelight. The chants of priests rise, solemn and soothing. The emperor's shadow passes down the nave, his robes trailing gold. Outside, the Bosphorus laps gently against the shores, ships rocking in the harbor. Life continues, fragile yet eternal. This was the age of Justinian, the age of dreams too vast for one man, the age of victories both glorious and hollow, the age when Constantinople seemed to touch heaven itself. And though storms gathered, for now the empire still stood tall, its heart beating strong, its soul radiant with faith and ambition. The reign of Justinian had ended in splendor and exhaustion. His monuments still gleamed. Hagia Sophia's dome caught the morning light like a second sun. The law codes preserved Rome's wisdom. The conquests had stretched the empire's reach farther than in centuries. Yet as the emperor's body was laid to rest in 565 CE, the seeds of decline were already sprouting. Justinian's dream had been too grand, too heavy for those who would come after him. Close your eyes and picture Constantinople in those years after his death. The streets are quieter now. The population has never fully recovered from the plague. Many houses stand empty, their doors sealed, their courtyards overgrown. Ships still enter the harbors, but fewer than before. In the marketplaces, the voices of merchants mingle with rumors of unrest at the borders. The people still look up at the golden dome of Hagia Sophia and whisper prayers, but behind their faith lingers an unease, as though shadows are lengthening across their world. For the truth is this: Justinian had won victories, but at terrible cost. The Italian wars had left the peninsula a wasteland, its cities depopulated, its farms ruined. The reconquered provinces in North Africa simmered with rebellion. Spain's outposts were fragile footholds at best. The treasury, drained by decades of war, struggled to fund both soldiers and rebuilding. And beyond all this loomed enemies who had not vanished: the Persians in the east, the Slavs and Avars pressing in from the north. The emperors who followed Justinian inherited an empire too large to defend and too weary to flourish. Justin II, his nephew, lacked his uncle's genius. His reign was marked by mental decline and indecisive policies. Then came Tiberius II and Maurice, men of some ability but forever trapped in the endless wars that drained men, gold, and hope. Picture now the eastern frontier, the great rivalry between Byzantium and Persia, a duel as old as the empires themselves. Across deserts and mountains, armies clashed, sieging cities, burning villages, carrying away captives. Neither side could strike a decisive blow. It was a war of grinding attrition. Soldiers marched endlessly across the Mesopotamian plains, fighting for fortresses that changed hands again and again. Tax collectors squeezed the peasants to fund it all, while the people of Constantinople grew restless, tired of hearing of victories that brought no peace. But if the East was a furnace, the Balkans were a leaking sieve. The Slavs, tribes from the forests of the north, poured across the Danube. They came not as armies, but as families, farmers, settlers, moving into the empire's rich lands. Villages vanished, towns were abandoned, Roman order receded. Soon the Balkans, once vibrant provinces, became wild frontier. Avars, nomadic warriors from the steppes, thundered in on horseback, their raids burning deep scars into the land. And then came the greatest disaster of all, a plague that would not leave. The plague of Justinian, the same that had emptied half the city in the 540 seconds, returned again and again in waves. Year after year, carts rolled through Constantinople, carrying the dead. Families vanished. Fields went untilled. Armies starved for recruits. Imagine the fear of the people: every cough, every fever, a possible death sentence. The empire was not just fighting enemies, it was fighting death itself. Yet amid the gloom, a figure of hope arose: Emperor Maurice, who ruled from 582 to 602. He was a soldier, disciplined, frugal, determined. He fought the Persians to a stalemate, pushed back the Slavs in the Balkans, and tried to reform the army. But his thrift made him unpopular. Soldiers went unpaid. The people resented his taxes. In the cold winter of 602, his own troops mutinied. They hailed a new emperor, Phocas, a brutal usurper, and Maurice with his sons was executed on the shores of the Bosphorus. This act, meant to end discontent, unleashed a storm. The Persian king Khosrow II, once held at bay by Maurice, declared war, claiming to avenge his fallen ally. His armies surged across the frontier. They swept through Mesopotamia, stormed Syria, took Palestine. In 614 CE, Jerusalem itself fell. The holy city, cradle of Christ, was plundered, its churches desecrated, its relics carried off to Persia. Imagine the shock that rippled through the Christian world. The true cross itself, the symbol of Christ's crucifixion, lost to the enemies of the faith. The Persians did not stop there. They pressed westward, capturing Egypt, the empire's breadbasket, the land whose grain fed Constantinople. With Egypt gone, famine gripped the capital. Markets emptied, bread grew scarce. The people turned against Emperor Phocas, whose cruelty and incompetence only deepened despair. Foreign envoys described him as a tyrant stained with blood. Finally, a revolt rose against him, led by Heraclius, the son of an exarch from North Africa. Sailing into Constantinople, Heraclius seized the throne in 610 CE. Now, imagine stepping into Heraclius's shoes. He was young, untested, and what he inherited was not an empire but a corpse. Persia held the east, the Slavs overran the Balkans, the treasury was empty, and Constantinople's people were starving. Many thought the empire would simply collapse, but Heraclius, against all odds, rose to the challenge. At first, he even considered abandoning Constantinople, fleeing to Carthage, and ruling from there. But he stayed. He reorganized the army, introducing a system that would shape Byzantium for centuries. The themes. Lands were granted to soldiers, who in return served as hereditary defenders of their provinces. It was a desperate gamble, but it worked. Slowly, painfully, Heraclius rebuilt. Then, in the 622nd, he struck back. In one of history's most daring campaigns, he marched his armies deep into Persia itself, across mountains and deserts, through lands no Byzantine army had ventured in generations. Battle after battle, he defeated the Persians, culminating in the great victory at Nineveh in 627 CE. Khosrow fled, overthrown by his own nobles. A peace was signed. The lost provinces were restored. The true cross was triumphantly returned to Jerusalem. Heraclius entered the city barefoot, carrying the relic himself. The people wept with joy. For a moment, it seemed Byzantium had been reborn. But fate had other plans. Both Byzantium and Persia were exhausted. Their armies bled dry, their treasuries empty. And from the deserts of Arabia, a new force was rising. United by the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, Arab tribes who had once been scattered now marched together under the banner of Islam. They were fierce, disciplined, and inspired. Almost immediately after Muhammad's death in 632 CE, Muslim armies burst forth. They struck with astonishing speed. In 636 CE, at the Battle of Yarmouk, the Byzantines suffered a catastrophic defeat. Syria was lost. Soon Palestine, Egypt, and much of Mesopotamia followed. The conquests came not just from superior tactics but from the weakness of the empire itself. Its people weary of endless wars and heavy taxes, some even preferring Muslim rule to distant imperial officials. For Byzantium, the losses were staggering. Egypt, the breadbasket, gone. Syria and Palestine, the Holy Lands, gone. Armenia, Mesopotamia, vast territories vanished in a matter of years. The empire that Justinian had expanded now shrank to its core. Anatolia, the Balkans, and Constantinople. Imagine the shock of the people of Constantinople, who had seen themselves as the center of the world. Now they were surrounded by enemies, their empire a shadow of what it had been. Churches once filled with worshippers now stood in Muslim lands. Caravans that had once carried silks and spices through Byzantine territory now traveled under different banners. The Mediterranean, once a Roman lake, was now contested. Heraclius, the hero who had defeated Persia, now lived to see his victories undone. In his final years, crippled and sick, he watched the empire shrink before his eyes. He died in 641 CE, his reign remembered both as a triumph and a tragedy. He had saved Byzantium from Persia, only to see it battered by a new and greater storm. And so, as we close this chapter, picture the empire at this moment in history. The golden dreams of Justinian had turned to dust. The reconquered provinces lost, the coffers empty, the frontiers shattered. Constantinople still stood, proud behind its mighty walls, but its empire had shrunk, its people humbled, its glory tarnished. Yet the story was not over. Byzantium was many times brought low, yet never destroyed. Its resilience, its ability to bend but not break, would carry it through centuries more. New emperors, new threats, new triumphs, and tragedies awaited. The city by the Bosphorus would endure, though the world around it had changed forever. The year was 641 CE. The great Emperor Heraclius, once hailed as the savior of Christendom for his victories over Persia, was dead. His empire, exhausted by decades of war, now faced a storm unlike any it had ever seen. To the south, across the deserts of Arabia, a new power had risen. The Arab tribes, united under the banner of Islam, surged forth with a speed and determination that stunned the world. Their armies moved like a tide, swift and unstoppable, and in the blink of a generation, they had taken from Byzantium its richest provinces, the very heartlands that had sustained the empire for centuries. Syria, Palestine, Egypt, all were lost. The caravans of grain from the Nile, once feeding 500,000 souls in Constantinople, stopped arriving. Antioch, Alexandria, and Jerusalem, once jewels in the crown of empire, now answered to Damascus. For the people of Constantinople, who had long believed themselves heirs to Rome, masters of the East, and guardians of the true faith, it was an unthinkable catastrophe. The loss was not merely of land, wealth, and tax revenues, but of identity itself. Yet despite these calamities, Byzantium endured. It endured because it had no other choice. The emperors who followed Heraclius did not inherit an empire of glory, but a state cornered, besieged, and bleeding. It was like a proud lion, once the king of its domain, reduced to a wounded beast, surrounded by hunters, clinging to survival with tooth and claw. The boy who took the throne in 641, Constans II, was barely 12 years old. Imagine him standing in the great cathedral of Hagia Sophia, crowned emperor under its vast dome, the mosaics glittering above his head, while all around him the clergy, generals, and senators hailed him as many years to the emperor. Yet, in his young eyes, there must have been fear. He inherited not the Roman Empire of old, but a fragile remnant, a realm that could collapse at any moment. Still, he grew into the role with an iron determination, shaping reforms that would preserve Byzantium for centuries. Constans II realized that the empire could not rely on its old system of defense. The vast professional armies stationed at distant frontiers were gone, swallowed up by defeat or captured along with the lands they once guarded. The empire's heart now lay in Anatolia, in the rugged mountains and fertile valleys of what we call Turkey today. There, Constans created the theme system, one of Byzantium's greatest innovations. Soldiers were no longer detached professionals but farmer warriors. They were given land to support themselves and their families, and in return, they served as soldiers, generation after generation. In this way, the army was rooted in the land. When Arab raiders swept into Anatolia, they did not face mercenaries fighting for pay, but peasants defending their homes, their families, their fields. It was a system born out of desperation, yet it gave Byzantium resilience, turning its core provinces into a vast fortress. Even so, the storm raged on. In 674 CE, the Arabs launched their boldest assault yet. Their fleets swept across the Mediterranean, their armies marched into Anatolia, and Constantinople itself was their prize. Picture the great city as it braced for siege. The Theodosian walls, immense triple lines of fortifications, stood tall and unbroken, monuments to Roman engineering that had defied Goths, Huns, and Persians. The city's harbors were sealed by great chains, the markets filled with fear, and the people turned to the Virgin Mary, their protector, believing she herself walked upon the ramparts at night. For 5 long years, the Arabs encircled Constantinople. Wave after wave of attacks crashed against its walls, and still the city stood. It was then that the Byzantines unveiled a weapon so terrifying, so mysterious, that it passed into legend: Greek fire. Imagine the horror of Arab sailors as Byzantine ships emerged from the harbors, their prows fitted with tubes, and suddenly gouts of flame erupted across the sea. This was no ordinary fire. It burned on water, clinging to ships and men alike, impossible to quench. Vessels burst into blazing infernos, sailors flung themselves screaming into the sea, only to find the waves themselves aflame. To their enemies, it seemed like sorcery, a hellish flame sent by God. The formula of Greek fire was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the empire. Was it made from naphtha, pitch, quicklime, sulfur? None can say. But its effect was undeniable. In 678, after years of futile assault, the Arab forces withdrew, shattered by walls, hunger, and fire. Constantinople had endured. This victory was more than just a reprieve. It was a psychological triumph. The Arab armies had seemed unstoppable, sweeping through Syria, Persia, and Egypt with ease. Now they had been checked, and at the very gates of Byzantium itself, the legend of Constantinople's invincibility deepened. The people of the city believed their survival was a miracle, that the Mother of God had shielded them. Hymns of thanksgiving echoed through Hagia Sophia as the defenders gave thanks for their deliverance. For Western Europe, fragile and disunited, Byzantium's survival was equally vital. Had Constantinople fallen in the 7th century, the floodgates of Islam might have poured into the Balkans, Italy, perhaps even into the heart of Europe. Byzantium was not just saving itself, it was a bulwark, buying time for the West to grow and recover. It stood as the wall between Islam and Europe for centuries. And yet, while Constantinople survived, its emperors often met bitter ends. Constans II himself, the boy who had grown into a hardened ruler, was murdered in Sicily in 668, struck down in his bath by an assassin wielding a bronze soap dish. His death was inglorious, yet his reforms endured. They gave Byzantium the backbone to withstand not just one siege but generations of assault. The empire entered what historians call the Isaurian Age, named for Leo III, the soldier emperor who rose to power in 717. Once again, Constantinople faced annihilation. An Arab army and fleet, even greater than before, surrounded the city, determined to succeed where the previous siege had failed. For months, the siege dragged on. Winter set in, supplies dwindled, disease ravaged the besiegers. And once again, Greek fire blazed across the waters, scattering enemy fleets in flames. At last, the Arabs withdrew in defeat. For the second time, Constantinople had turned back the storm. Leo III became a hero, a savior of the empire. Yet he and his son, Constantine V, also unleashed one of Byzantium's most divisive controversies: iconoclasm. The emperors declared that the veneration of holy icons, the painted images of Christ, the Virgin, and the saints, was idolatry. Soldiers marched into churches, tearing down mosaics, whitewashing walls, burning sacred panels. For generations, the empire was torn apart in a bitter struggle. Monks defended the icons, emperors condemned them, and the people themselves were divided. Was an icon a window to the divine, or a betrayal of the commandment against graven images? The controversy raged for more than a century, weakening the empire from within, even as it faced enemies from without. In the end, the icons triumphed. In 843, their veneration was restored, and to this day, the Orthodox Church celebrates that moment as the triumph of orthodoxy. Through all these storms, Arab invasions, sieges, religious strife, Byzantium endured. It became a different empire than before. Smaller, harder, less universal. No longer the sprawling dominion of Justinian, it was now a fortress empire, rooted in Anatolia, shielded by its walls and fire, sustained by its farmer soldiers. And yet it was not only through arms that Byzantium survived. Its emperors mastered diplomacy as a weapon as potent as any sword. They sent gold, silks, and titles to buy peace, to sow division among their enemies, to play one barbarian against another. Enemies called it trickery. The Byzantines called it survival. Imagine a night in 8th century Anatolia. A soldier farmer sits by the hearth, his children asleep, his wife weaving by the fire. His sword lies close at hand, sharpened after a long day in the fields. In the distance, bells toll from a monastery, their echoes drifting across the valley. He knows that raiders may come tomorrow, that war may reach his doorstep, yet he also knows he is part of something greater, a 1,000-year struggle, a faith, an empire that refuses to die. And so, Byzantium endured. It had shrunk, bled, and transformed, but it remained. The Empire of Rome lived on, battered yet unbroken, its heartbeat echoing through the centuries. Ahead lay new dynasties, new glories, and new disasters, for Byzantium's story was never one of steady rise or inevitable fall. It was a rhythm, like the tide crashing down, then rising again, each wave shaping the world around it. The empire that had staggered through siege and strife now began, almost unexpectedly, to breathe again. After centuries of contraction, of desperate defense, and near collapse, Byzantium entered an age of revival. It was not the vast empire of Justinian's dreams, nor the universal dominion of Constantine the Great, but it was strong, clever, and fiercely alive. Out of the shadows of the 8th and 9th centuries rose a dynasty that would be remembered for both power and brilliance, the Macedonians. Imagine the streets of Constantinople in the middle of the 9th century. The scars of iconoclasm still marked the churches, where mosaics had been ripped down and later restored, but the people bustled with a renewed confidence. Merchants from Venice, Cairo, and the Black Sea shouted in the markets. Scribes bent over their manuscripts in candle-lit rooms, copying the works of Homer, Plato, and Galen. The smell of baked bread and roasting meats drifted from taverns. The mighty dome of Hagia Sophia still glittered in the morning sun, its mosaics restored, a jewel of the Christian world. The empire had shrunk from its earlier borders, but within those limits it had discovered resilience, creativity, and a renewed sense of mission. The rise of Basil I marked a turning point. His story was almost mythic, a reminder that in Byzantium, emperors were not always born but could also be made. Basil began as a peasant, born in the rugged hills of Macedonia. Through strength, cunning, and ambition, he clawed his way upward, serving as a stable boy, then as a wrestler, then as a bodyguard. Fortune smiled on him when he won the favor of Emperor Michael III. In time, Basil maneuvered himself into supreme power, becoming emperor in 867. His ascent was a testament to the strange, unpredictable nature of Byzantine politics, where a farmer's son could become master of Constantinople, crowned beneath Hagia Sophia's vast dome. Basil and his successors oversaw a period historians call the Macedonian Renaissance. It was a time when Byzantium seemed reborn, when the empire's armies pushed outward, its scholars revived classical learning, and its artists filled churches with radiant mosaics. Imagine the empire not merely surviving, but once again expanding, radiating influence across the Mediterranean. One of the empire's greatest weapons was not its armies, but its diplomacy. The Byzantines were masters of soft power. They dazzled foreign envoys with the splendor of Constantinople, golden thrones that moved mechanically, lions that roared in the imperial palace, fountains that sparkled with wine. Visitors left awed, convinced that the emperor was no mere man but God's chosen ruler on earth. Gifts of silks, marriages with imperial princesses, and the promise of trade deals bound neighboring rulers into webs of loyalty and dependence. Byzantine diplomacy was subtle, clever, and relentless. Gold could buy what armies could not conquer. But armies still mattered, and under the Macedonians, they became formidable once again. Byzantine generals, hardened by generations of frontier warfare, began to strike back. In the east, they retook Crete from Arab pirates in 961, a stunning victory that restored Christian control over the island after more than a century of Muslim rule. They reconquered Cyprus, parts of Syria, and advanced deep into Armenia. In the Balkans, they fought Bulgarians with grim determination. Basil II, remembered by history as the Bulgar Slayer, waged a long and brutal war against the Bulgars, culminating in the crushing victory at the Battle of Kleidion in 1014. It is said that after capturing thousands of enemy soldiers, Basil ordered them blinded, leaving only one man in every 100 with a single eye to guide the rest home. The horror of that sight broke the Bulgar spirit, and their kingdom soon fell under Byzantine control. It was a ruthless act, but one that demonstrated the terrible resolve of a once again mighty empire. And yet, it was not only war that defined this era. The Macedonian Renaissance also saw a flowering of culture, learning, and faith. Constantinople became the intellectual hub of the Christian world. Scholars compiled encyclopedias of knowledge, preserving not only their own heritage but also the wisdom of ancient Greece and Rome. Monks illuminated manuscripts with vivid images, their careful hands ensuring that works which might otherwise have vanished into oblivion endured. Artists adorned churches with glittering mosaics, where Christ Pantocrator gazed down from golden domes, serene and eternal, his eyes following the faithful wherever they walked. Religion, too, played a defining role. The empire saw itself as the defender of orthodoxy, the pure and uncorrupted faith, yet it also sought to expand its influence beyond its borders. In the 9th century, Byzantine missionaries Cyril and Methodius traveled north to the Slavs, creating an alphabet so that the Bible could be translated into their language. This gift, the Cyrillic script, still shapes the written culture of Eastern Europe today. The conversion of the Slavic world was one of Byzantium's greatest achievements. Bulgaria, Serbia, and above all, Russia embraced Orthodox Christianity, creating a spiritual empire that outlasted Byzantium itself. The crowning moment came in 988, when Prince Vladimir of Kiev accepted baptism, bringing his people into the Orthodox fold. He sent envoys to Constantinople, and when they entered Hagia Sophia, they declared they had not known whether they were in heaven or on earth. The beauty of the liturgy, the incense, the chanting, the golden mosaics, it overwhelmed them. Vladimir married a Byzantine princess, Anna, binding Rus and Byzantium together. The Third Rome was born in Russia's imagination, a legacy that would shape centuries of history long after Constantinople fell. But within the empire itself, shadows lurked. The Macedonian emperors were brilliant, but also ruthless. Palace intrigues, assassinations, and plots remained the fabric of imperial life. The vast bureaucracy, so efficient in preserving order, could become rigid and corrupt. Landowning aristocrats began to dominate the countryside, squeezing small farmers and threatening the very military system that had preserved Byzantium in its darkest hours. For all its splendor, the empire carried within it the seeds of future decline. Still, for the people of Constantinople, this was a golden age. Imagine walking through the city around the year 1000. The streets thronged with merchants speaking a dozen tongues. The air was filled with the clatter of carts, the cries of hawkers, the songs of sailors. The harbors were crowded with ships carrying grain from the Black Sea, silks from the east, spices from Arabia, furs from the north. The hippodrome roared with the cheers of tens of thousands, as the blues and greens raced their chariots around its track. At night, oil lamps flickered in the windows, casting golden light on the marble streets. And always, rising above it all, Hagia Sophia glowed with its dome, like a beacon visible for miles. To a weary traveler from the West, the city must have seemed like a vision. Western Europe, in these centuries, was still struggling with feudalism, warlords, and fragile kingdoms. But Constantinople was a metropolis, the largest city in Christendom, with aqueducts, sewers, hospitals, and libraries. It was the envy of the world. For a time it seemed eternal, untouchable, the last great jewel of Rome. Yet history is never static. Even as Byzantium basked in this brilliance, dangers loomed. To the east, new powers stirred the Seljuk Turks, fierce nomads who would one day carve out empires of their own. To the west, the rising might of Latin Europe was beginning to stir, its knights and princes looking hungrily eastward. And within, the same struggles that had haunted Byzantium for centuries, ambition, division, and pride, still whispered in the corridors of the palace. But for now, under the Macedonian emperors, the empire stood tall. Its armies marched in triumph. Its churches glittered with mosaics. Its scholars preserved the wisdom of the ancients. It was a moment of glory, of resilience, a reminder that Byzantium, though battered by storms, still had the power to dazzle the world. The tide of history had brought it low, but the tide had risen again, and as the lamps were lit in Hagia Sophia, as the chants of Vespers filled the air, as the golden mosaics flickered in the candlelight, the people of Constantinople could believe once more that their empire, blessed by God and guarded by the Virgin, would endure forever. The empire that Basil II left behind in 1025 was a titan, a colossus that bestrode the Mediterranean. Its borders stretched further than they had in centuries. Its armies were seasoned, its treasury overflowing with gold, and its prestige unmatched. Basil had crushed the Bulgarians, humbled the Arabs, and secured the empire against its enemies. To contemporaries, it must have seemed as though Byzantium had at last secured an unshakable place in the world, an empire that might endure forever. But history has a way of mocking certainty. For all the iron discipline and relentless victories of Basil II, the decades that followed his death revealed the fragility beneath Byzantium's glittering armor. And so begins one of the most haunting chapters of the Byzantine story, where an empire at its zenith began the slow descent into crisis and decline. Picture the funeral procession of Basil II in 1025. The streets of Constantinople were hushed as the body of the Bulgar slayer was carried through the avenues, past the hippodrome, where he had watched countless races, past the markets where merchants hawked silks and spices, up toward the mighty church of St. John the theologian at the Hebdomon. The people mourned him with a mix of reverence and awe. For more than 40 years, he had been their protector, their general, their emperor. He had led them personally into battle, endured winters in the Balkans alongside them, and emerged undefeated. His death left a void that no successor could fill. The problem was not simply that Basil had no children. He had refused marriage altogether, devoting himself wholly to war. He left the throne to his brother, Constantine XI, a man who could not have been more different. Where Basil was ascetic, disciplined, and ruthless, Constantine was indulgent, fond of luxury and courtly pleasures. He reigned only 3 years before dying, leaving behind daughters but no sons. From that moment, the imperial succession grew increasingly unstable, passing from one relative to another, often manipulated by court factions, generals, and ambitious aristocrats. The stability of Basil's reign gave way to chaos. Powerful noble families began to dominate the empire, accumulating vast estates and undermining the small farmers who had long formed the backbone of the Byzantine army. Where Basil had kept the aristocracy firmly in check, his weaker successors allowed them to flourish, draining the state of revenue and manpower. The theme system, that ingenious arrangement of military provinces that had sustained Byzantium for centuries, began to wither. Soldiers who had once defended their lands now found themselves dispossessed, while mercenaries increasingly filled the ranks of the army. The decline was gradual, almost invisible at first. The empire was still rich, its capital still magnificent. To a visitor from the west, Constantinople seemed as glorious as ever, its palaces and churches shining with gold, its markets overflowing with goods. But beneath the glitter, cracks were spreading. One of the first signs of trouble came from the east. In the mid-11th century, a new power emerged on the steppes of Central Asia, the Seljuk Turks. Fierce nomadic horsemen who had converted to Islam, the Seljuks swept across Persia and Mesopotamia, carving out an empire of their own. They were unlike the Arabs Byzantium had faced before. Masters of mounted archery, they struck with terrifying speed, overwhelming traditional armies with their mobility. By the 1062nd, they had pushed into Anatolia, Byzantium's heartland. The empire still had powerful generals, But the court in Constantinople had grown decadent, suspicious of its own commanders, and consumed with intrigue. In 1071, Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes marched east to confront the Seljuks, determined to restore the empire's honor. His army was large, drawn from across the empire, and including mercenaries from the west. But it was also divided, its loyalty uncertain. At the fields of Manzikert, near Lake Van in eastern Anatolia, the fate of Byzantium was sealed. Romanos engaged the Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan in battle, and at first the Byzantines held their own. But betrayals struck. Parts of the Byzantine army abandoned the field, and confusion spread. Romanos himself fought bravely, but his forces collapsed. In the chaos, he was captured, the first Byzantine emperor ever taken alive by a Muslim enemy. The shock was immense. Though Alp Arslan treated Romanos with courtesy, releasing him after negotiations, the damage was irreparable. Anatolia, the breadbasket of the empire and its greatest source of soldiers, was thrown open to Turkish settlement. Villages were abandoned, cities fell, and within a generation, much of the plateau was lost. Byzantium's heart had been pierced. Back in Constantinople, the humiliation deepened. Romanos was deposed, blinded, and sent into exile by rivals. Civil wars erupted, with aristocratic families and military commanders vying for power. As Byzantium tore itself apart, the Turks advanced further, tightening their grip on Anatolia. The empire that Basil II had left secure just decades earlier was now staggering, and yet Byzantium did not collapse. Out of the turmoil rose a new dynasty, the Komnenoi, who would breathe fresh life into the empire. Alexios I Komnenos, who seized the throne in 1081, was a soldier of skill and determination. He faced enemies on every front: Norman adventurers in the west, Pecheneg raiders in the north, Seljuks in the east. His treasury was empty, his army unreliable. But Alexios was cunning. He reformed the military, forged alliances, and used diplomacy as a weapon. It was Alexios who appealed to the west for aid, hoping to recruit mercenaries to fight the Turks. He could not have foreseen what that appeal would unleash. In 1095, at the Council of Clermont, Pope Urban II called for a holy war to liberate Jerusalem. Tens of thousands of knights, peasants, and adventurers from across Europe flocked eastward, fired by religious zeal and dreams of plunder. The First Crusade arrived in Constantinople like a storm. Alexios was astonished by the sheer numbers and ferocity of these Latin knights. To the Byzantines, they seemed both barbaric and terrifying. Fierce warriors, but crude in manners, ignorant of imperial protocol, and prone to violence. Yet Alexios played his hand shrewdly. He extracted oaths of loyalty from the Crusader leaders, ensuring that lands recovered from the Turks would be returned to Byzantium. For a time, it worked. The Crusaders retook Nicaea and Antioch, restoring parts of Anatolia to Byzantine control. They went on to capture Jerusalem, establishing Crusader states in the Levant. Byzantium benefited, regaining territories it had lost and enjoying a renewed sense of security. But the seeds of mistrust had been sown. The Latins viewed the Byzantines as duplicitous, effeminate, and greedy. The Byzantines saw the Latins as brutish, untrustworthy, and dangerous. Still, under Alexios and his successors, John II and Manuel I, the Komnenian dynasty restored much of Byzantium's strength. They reformed the economy, rebuilt the army, and reasserted the empire's influence in the Balkans and the eastern Mediterranean. Constantinople flourished once again, its markets humming, its churches filled with worshippers, its scholars debating philosophy and theology. The empire was no longer the vast power of Basil II's day, but it was resilient, alive, and still formidable. And yet, always, shadows lingered. The reliance on mercenaries drained the treasury. The aristocracy remained powerful and restless. The church was divided, its relations with Rome strained by theological disputes and cultural differences. And looming over all, was the question of succession. Strong emperors could hold the empire together. Weak ones could unravel it in a single reign. The 12th century saw moments of brilliance, but also growing instability. Manuel I, charismatic and ambitious, dreamed of restoring Byzantium as the dominant power of the Mediterranean. He waged wars in Italy, Hungary, and Anatolia, but his ambitions outstripped his resources. When he died in 1180, the empire was left weakened, its enemies circling. What followed was a series of crises: court intrigue, incompetent emperors, and foreign invasions. The Normans sacked Thessalonica in 1185, shocking the empire. The Bulgarians rose again, regaining independence. And in the west, a new crusade was brewing, one that would not only fail to aid Byzantium, but would turn against it with catastrophic consequences. Through all these trials, the people of Constantinople continued their daily lives. The markets bustled, the hippodrome roared, the churches glowed with candlelight. To a citizen, it may have seemed that the empire was eternal, as it had always been. The Theodosian walls still stood, impregnable, a symbol of unbroken defense. Hagia Sophia still crowned the skyline, a beacon of faith. The emperor still ruled, crowned by God and anointed by the patriarch. But history was moving, inexorably, toward disaster. The empire had survived Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, and Turks. It had endured sieges, plagues, and civil wars. But the blow that was coming would be unlike any it had faced before. For the greatest betrayal was not to come from its enemies, but from those who called themselves its brothers in Christ. And so, as the 12th century drew to a close, the lamps of Constantinople still glowed in the night, its streets alive with voices, its palaces rich with treasures. But far to the west, in the courts of Venice and Rome, plans were being laid, deals struck, and ambitions sharpened. Soon, an army would march not to save Byzantium, but to plunder it. And the greatest city of Christendom, which had stood for nearly 1,000 years, would face its darkest hour. The dawn of the 13th century found Constantinople glittering as ever. From the outside, it was still the queen of cities. Its immense walls rose threefold along the landward side, their towers crowned with banners that fluttered in the sea breeze. The domes of its churches, most of all the mighty Hagia Sophia, gleamed like burnished gold when the sun struck them. Its harbors brimmed with ships from every corner of the known world. Venetians, Genoese, Arabs, Jews, Armenians, Syrians, and Russians haggled in its markets, bartering silks, spices, furs, and precious stones. At night, the city hummed with the voices of thousands, torches flickering across the skyline, the sea wind carrying the distant music of taverns, and the solemn chant of monks echoing from cloisters. To its citizens, the empire seemed eternal. Though smaller than in the days of Basil II, Byzantium still controlled Thrace, Macedonia, and much of Greece. It commanded respect, for Constantinople's walls had never been breached, and the empire's spiritual prestige as the heir of Rome remained immense. The Latin West might sneer at the Greeks as effeminate or cunning, but it was to Constantinople that merchants sailed, and it was from Constantinople that the grandeur of the Caesars still radiated. Yet beneath the glittering surface, all was not well. The throne had become unstable, disputed by factions of nobles, generals, and schemers. The dynasty of the Angeloi, which ruled at the dawn of the 13th century, was weak, corrupt, and often incompetent. Emperors squandered resources on luxury while neglecting the army and the navy. Revenues were farmed out to greedy tax collectors, who squeezed the people while enriching themselves. The bureaucracy grew bloated, while real power slipped from imperial hands into the grip of Italian merchant states. Venice, above all, had established itself as the empire's indispensable partner, controlling vital shipping lanes and securing favorable trading privileges that undermined Byzantine merchants. It was into this fragile world that the Fourth Crusade was born. Officially, it was a holy war, called in 1202 by Pope Innocent III, with the goal of striking Egypt, then the richest province of the Muslim world, and from there, retaking Jerusalem. Thousands of knights across Europe, particularly in France, answered the call, eager to win salvation, glory, and plunder. But unlike earlier crusades, this one quickly lost its way, tangled in debts, politics, and ambition. The Crusaders had struck a deal with Venice. In return for building and supplying a massive fleet to carry them east, they agreed to pay the Venetians a colossal sum. But when the time came, the Crusaders could not raise the full amount. The Venetians, under their doge, Enrico Dandolo, a man already in his 90s and blind but still sharp and ruthless, proposed an alternative. If the Crusaders would attack the Adriatic city of Zara, a rival to Venetian trade, the debt could be reduced. Zara was a Christian city, but the Crusaders, desperate and pressed, agreed. They sacked Zara in 1202, to the horror of many, and in doing so drew excommunication from the Pope himself. The crusade had already strayed from its holy mission, and the road eastward grew ever more twisted. Into this volatile mix stepped a Byzantine prince. Alexios Angelos, son of the deposed Emperor Isaac II, saw in the Crusaders a chance to reclaim his throne from his uncle, Alexios III. He promised them vast sums of gold, support for their crusade, and even the reunion of the Eastern and Western churches under papal authority if they would help him. To knights weighed down by debt and promises of divine reward, the offer was irresistible. To the Venetians, it meant access to the riches of Constantinople, and so, a crusade meant for Jerusalem turned its sails toward the Queen of Cities. Imagine the shock of Constantinople's citizens in the summer of 1203 as fleets bearing the Red Cross appeared on the horizon. To see armies that claimed to fight for Christ arrayed before their walls was bewildering, terrifying. The Crusaders demanded the throne for young Alexios, and when resistance proved weak, the city fell to them with relative ease. Alexios IV, as he became, attempted to honor his promises. He opened the treasury, taxed the people heavily, and melted down sacred treasures to pay the Latins. He declared loyalty to Rome, a move that inflamed deep resentment. For the Orthodox, it was betrayal. Better the Sultan's turban than the cardinal's hat, many whispered, recalling the bloody memory of earlier Latin arrogance. The tension grew unbearable. Riots broke out. Fires spread through districts of the city. The Crusaders, camped outside the walls, grew restless as payments lagged. By 1204, the fragile alliance shattered. The Byzantines, desperate, overthrew Alexios' force. But this only enraged the Crusaders and the Venetians. Their patience gone, their coffers empty, they resolved to take the city for themselves. And so came April 1204, the darkest month in the city's long history. The Latins prepared their assault with grim determination. Venetian ships, fitted with siege towers, closed upon the seawalls along the Golden Horn, while Crusader ladders and rams battered the land walls. At first, the defenders held, but after days of relentless assault, the Latins broke through. On April 13th, the walls were breached, and Constantinople, once impregnable, proud, and eternal, was theirs. What followed was 3 days of horror. The Crusaders poured into the streets, swords drawn, banners flapping. They plundered churches, palaces, and homes without mercy. Priceless relics, chalices, and icons were carried off. The bronze horses of the Hippodrome, ancient masterpieces from pagan Rome, were torn down and shipped to Venice, where they stand even today. The Hagia Sophia, that great jewel of Christendom, was desecrated. Its altar was smashed, its mosaics defiled, its holy spaces profaned. Chroniclers speak of drunken soldiers riding mules into the sanctuary, of prostitutes dancing where priests had once chanted. The people of Constantinople, unarmed and unprepared, were slaughtered in their thousands. Women were raped, children enslaved, families torn apart. Monks were cut down in their cloisters, libraries burned, manuscripts lost forever. The greatest repository of ancient and Christian knowledge in the world was ransacked by men who had sworn to fight for Christ. The city that had endured for 9 centuries fell not to Persians or Arabs or Turks, but to fellow Christians. For 3 days, the orgy of destruction continued, until the Latins declared an end and divided the spoils. Constantinople, jewel of the East, lay gutted, its treasures scattered across Europe. The empire itself was torn apart. A Latin Empire of Constantinople was declared, with Baldwin of Flanders as its emperor, while Venice claimed swathes of territory and trading privileges. The Byzantine aristocracy fled to form successor states, Nicaea in Asia Minor, Epirus in Greece, Trebizond on the Black Sea. The empire survived in fragments, but the damage was mortal. The psychological blow was even deeper. The schism between East and West, already bitter, became irreconcilable. The Orthodox could never forgive the Latins for their treachery. The name Frank became a curse in Byzantine mouths, and the empire, even when it retook Constantinople in 1261, was never the same. Its wealth was gone, its population diminished, its confidence shattered. The Queen of Cities was restored, but she was a shadow, her jewels stolen, her spirit wounded. The sack of Constantinople in 1204 marked the true turning point of Byzantine history. Though the empire lingered for another 2 centuries, its decline was set. The Ottomans would one day deliver the final blow, but it was the Latins' supposed brothers in Christ who inflicted the mortal wound, and for centuries thereafter, the ruins of the city whispered of betrayal. Imagine, if you will, walking those streets after the sack. The air thick with smoke, the stench of fire and blood. Marble statues toppled, their faces cracked. Mosaics darkened by soot, their saints' eyes staring blankly. The hippodrome silent, its crowds gone. The once bustling markets emptied, their stalls smashed. And above it all, the silence of Hagia Sophia, its golden dome still standing, but inside, its sanctity gone. For the Byzantines who survived, it must have felt as though the world had ended. For those who remembered the days of Basil II, when the empire had seemed invincible, the fall of 1204 was a nightmare too cruel to comprehend. The empire would stagger on, rebuild and reclaim the city, but the dream of Rome reborn was dead. The betrayal of brothers, the sack of Constantinople, is not merely a tale of conquest and greed. It is a tragedy of misplaced trust, of ambition gone awry, of a civilization undone not by its enemies, but by those it had once called allies. And in the long centuries since, it remains one of the darkest scars upon the history of Christendom. The sack of 1204 left the Queen of Cities in ruin, but Byzantium was not yet dead. Imagine the flight of its people in the weeks that followed. Aristocrats who had once strolled marble courtyards with silken robes now fled across mountains and sea, their families huddled in wagons, their treasures bundled in sacks. Monks carried relics wrapped in cloth, whispering prayers as smoke from burning churches still darkened the sky behind them. Clerks and scribes clutched manuscripts to their chests, guarding words that might outlive the fall of their empire. Ordinary citizens, dazed and terrified, fled in whatever direction seemed safe, their eyes burning with tears, as they looked back one last time at the shimmering dome of Hagia Sophia, now crowned not with incense and liturgy, but with soldiers' boots and the cries of looting. For those who survived, life after Constantinople was disorienting. They had been the citizens of the greatest city in Christendom, heirs of Constantine, guardians of Rome's ancient flame. Suddenly, they were refugees, scattered across a fractured landscape, their empire reduced to a memory, and their rulers displaced. Yet in the heart of exile there still beat a stubborn pulse. Byzantium, though wounded, refused to die. And like a phoenix that must pass through fire to be reborn, the empire's remnants gathered themselves in new lands, determined to preserve their legacy until the day might come when Constantinople could be reclaimed. The strongest of these fragments rose in Nicaea, a city in northwestern Anatolia, not far across the Bosphorus from Constantinople itself. Once the site of the great church council that had defined the faith of Christendom, Nicaea seemed destined to serve again as a place of renewal. The man who led this fragile rebirth was Theodore Lascaris, son-in-law of the last legitimate emperor before the Crusaders stormed the walls. In the chaos, Theodore proved steady, clever, and determined. He proclaimed himself emperor, not merely to soothe his pride but to remind his people that the Roman line had not been broken, only displaced. In Nicaea, Theodore and his successors built something remarkable. They gathered officials, scholars, and generals who had escaped the sack, setting up a court in exile that mirrored the lost splendor of Constantinople. Imperial ceremonies were maintained, albeit with humbler trappings. The bureaucracy, battered but unbowed, began again to issue decrees. The Church, deeply shaken by the Latin conquest and the forced union with Rome, rallied around Nicaea, preserving orthodoxy as the heart of Byzantine identity. In every ritual, every prayer, every act of governance, the exiled emperors sent the same message: Byzantium lives. Imagine the mood of those early years. The streets of Nicaea crowded with refugees, their speech heavy with grief, yet also defiance. Within the churches, priests urged their flocks to hold fast, to remember that Constantinople was theirs by right, that the Latins were usurpers who could never erase the empire's true soul. Children who had been carried from the burning city grew up in Nicaea, hearing tales of golden domes and endless markets, of palaces whose marble shone brighter than snow. For them, Constantinople was half memory, half myth, a paradise lost that haunted their dreams and fueled their resolve. Meanwhile, the so-called Latin Empire of Constantinople struggled. Its rulers, men like Baldwin of Flanders, styled themselves emperors but lacked the legitimacy of Roman heritage. They relied heavily on Venetian merchants, who carved the city and its ports into enclaves for their trade. The Latin lords quarreled among themselves, and the Greek population despised them. Constantinople, stripped of its treasures, no longer glittered as before. Many who had once marveled at its grandeur described a shadow city, where abandoned houses lined empty streets and once proud monuments stood blackened and broken. Even the Hagia Sophia, desecrated and converted into a Latin cathedral, felt hollow, its mosaics dimmed, its silence oppressive. The exiles of Nicaea knew that time was on their side. They did not need to destroy the Latin Empire in one stroke. They needed only to survive, to outlast their conquerors, to slowly reclaim the lands around them and encircle Constantinople like a hunter circling prey. And so they did. Theodore and his successors forged alliances with local rulers, won battles against rival Greeks in Epirus and Trebizond, and most of all, secured the loyalty of their people by presenting themselves as guardians of orthodoxy. Where the Latins imposed the Pope's authority, Nicaea defended the faith of the Fathers. Where the Latins plundered relics, Nicaea sheltered them. Where the Latins ruled as foreigners, the Nicaean emperors ruled as Romans in exile. Among the most remarkable of these rulers was John III Ducas Vatatzes, who ascended the throne in 1222. John was no idle prince. He was a soldier, a reformer, and a man of great foresight. He expanded Nicaea's territories into Thrace, reclaimed towns and fortresses, and built an army loyal not only to him but to the idea of Byzantium restored. He encouraged agriculture, reduced the dependence on expensive foreign imports, and strove to make his people self-sufficient. Chroniclers describe him as generous yet disciplined, a man who walked among his subjects, speaking kindly and listening to their grievances. To those who longed for Constantinople, he was proof that the empire's glory could return. In his reign, the dream of restoration grew closer. The Latin Empire weakened year by year, its coffers drained, its population dwindling, its rulers increasingly isolated. Western Europe, once enthusiastic about the conquest of Constantinople, quickly lost interest. The Crusader states in the Holy Land demanded attention, and the papacy found itself embroiled in disputes closer to home. Without constant reinforcements, the Latin grip on the city loosened. By mid-century, it seemed inevitable that the Greeks of Nicaea would reclaim their capital. Yet history never grants triumph easily. Nicaea's rulers faced rivals not only in the Latins but in Epirus, whose ambitious despots dreamed of seizing Constantinople for themselves. They faced raids from Turks in Anatolia, who eyed the shrinking Byzantine frontier hungrily. And within, they faced the same challenges that had long plagued the empire: ambitious nobles, jealous factions, and the weight of maintaining legitimacy in exile. But through all of this, the vision of Constantinople gleamed like a beacon. Every setback, every war, every negotiation circled around the same hope: the return to the Queen of Cities. Finally, in 1261, under Michael VIII Palaiologos, the moment arrived. Michael, shrewd and ambitious, had secured his position through ruthless skill, sidelining the boy emperor whose throne he usurped. He knew that to cement his legitimacy he needed more than titles. He needed Constantinople, and fate, as though weary of denying the Byzantines, placed opportunity in his hands. That summer, Michael's general, Alexios Strategopoulos, led a small force to scout near Constantinople. By chance, he discovered that the Venetian fleet, which guarded the city's harbor, was absent, engaged elsewhere. The city, though still walled and defended, was vulnerable. Strategopoulos took the risk. With stealth and daring, his men crept through a neglected gate, surprising the Latin garrison. The Greeks of the city, long resentful of Latin rule, rose up to join them. Panic spread. The Latin emperor, Baldwin II, fled in haste, abandoning his crown, his treasure, and even his boots. By the time the Venetians returned, it was too late. Constantinople, against all odds, had been restored. Imagine the scene on the 15th of August 1261, as Michael VIII entered the city in triumph. The Hagia Sophia was reconsecrated with Orthodox liturgy, incense once more filling the Golden Dome. The streets, scarred by fire and neglect, echoed with cheers and tears as citizens welcomed their emperor. For the first time in nearly 60 years, the Roman Empire of the East was home again. The dream of the exiles had been fulfilled, yet the victory carried shadows. The Constantinople that Michael reclaimed was not the same city that had dazzled the world before 1204. Its population was smaller, its wealth drained, its monuments scarred. Venetian and Genoese merchants still dominated trade, and the empire's territories were diminished. Byzantium had survived, yes, but it was no longer the radiant superpower of old. The Palaiologan restoration gave it 2 more centuries of life, but the empire's strength had been fatally sapped. For the people of Nicaea, who had endured exile, however, none of this mattered in the moment. To walk once more through the streets of Constantinople, to kneel once more beneath the mosaics of Hagia Sophia, to hear once more the cry of Christos Anesti echoing through the city's vaults, this was triumph beyond imagining. They had lost everything, yet by endurance, cunning, and faith, they had regained their heart. And so the exiled empire ended, and the Palaiologan dynasty began. But beneath the joy lingered a sobering truth. The sack of 1204 had changed Byzantium forever. The empire restored was a shadow, its strength fragile, its enemies gathering. The phoenix had risen from the ashes, but its wings were weakened, its feathers singed. The fire that had nearly consumed it still smoldered in the distance, and soon it would blaze again. The year 1261 should have felt like a dawn. Trumpets sounded as Michael VIII Palaiologos processed into Constantinople, his robes shimmering with gold thread, incense rising around him as priests chanted hymns that had been silenced for nearly 60 years. The Hagia Sophia rang once more with the voices of Orthodox choirs. Citizens wept with relief, kneeling in the streets, as the imperial banners unfurled again from the ramparts. For a moment, the dream of exile seemed fulfilled. The nightmare of 1204 ended, yet as the incense cleared and the celebrations quieted, a deeper truth began to reveal itself. The city Michael had entered was not the Constantinople of Justinian or Basil, not the mighty thrumming capital of an empire stretching across seas and continents. It was a hollowed shell, scarred, depopulated, and fragile. The queen had been restored to her throne, but her crown was dented, her robes torn, her jewels pawned. The shadow of decline hung heavy over her battered walls. Those who walked the streets in the days after the Restoration saw not triumph but ruin. Once glittering palaces stood as charred husks. The vast hippodrome, where emperors had been acclaimed by roaring crowds of 100,000, lay silent. Its bronze statues carried off to Venice or melted for coin. Markets that had once overflowed with silks and spices from every corner of the world now held only a trickle of goods, for trade had been diverted to Genoese and Venetian ports. Even Hagia Sophia, despite its combati of Sia, reconsecration, bore wounds, its mosaics dulled by smoke, its treasures stripped, its marble altars hacked apart. Constantinople, jewel of the world, had been looted like a corpse, and Michael VIII inherited a city in need of resurrection. Michael himself was a man of contradictions, clever, ruthless, pragmatic, and ambitious. He knew that to hold Constantinople was not enough. He needed legitimacy, not only in the eyes of his subjects but in the wider world. He crushed rivals, blinded the young boy emperor he had displaced, and sought recognition from the Pope, even at the cost of pledging church union with Rome. This bargain, made at the Council of Lyons in 1274, bought him time and deterred Western invasions, but at a steep price. His own people despised him for it. To the clergy and the faithful, union with Rome was betrayal, a selling of their souls to the very Latins who had desecrated their city. Michael's name became cursed in monasteries, and though he kept the empire alive, his reign left a bitter taste that lingered long after his death. As the years passed, it became clear that the empire restored was an empire diminished. The Palaiologoi could no longer project power across the Mediterranean. Their armies were small, often composed of mercenaries whose loyalty depended on pay that was increasingly scarce. Their navy, once the terror of the seas, had withered, leaving them dependent on Genoese or Venetian fleets, both of whom demanded concessions that bled Byzantine trade and sovereignty. The empire's borders shrank steadily, chipped away by Bulgarians in the north, Serbs in the west, and Turks in the east. Constantinople remained, yes, and its walls still defied any direct assault, but the lands that fed it, the provinces that had sustained it, were slipping away like sand through an open palm. Imagine life within the city in these centuries. The population, once perhaps 500,000, dwindled to a fraction. Whole districts lay empty, their belation, houses collapsed, their gardens overtaken by weeds. Travelers from the West described Constantinople not as the wonder of the world, but as a ghost city, grand in outline, but hollow within. Chickens scratched where scholars had once debated in the squares. Merchants' stalls echoed with silence, and yet, amid the decay, there lingered beauty. The great dome of Hagia Sophia still gleamed in the morning light. The sea walls still rose, proud and formidable, against the waves. The city still carried an aura, as if the ghosts of emperors past walked its streets at dusk, whispering reminders of what had once been. The Palaiologan dynasty, stretched thin, sought survival through diplomacy more than war. They played rivals against each other, balancing Serbs against Bulgarians, Venetians against Genoese, even Christians against Muslims, always with the hope of buying more time. They sent brides to foreign courts, daughters of emperors, crossing seas to marry kings and princes in Serbia, Hungary, or beyond. They sent embassies to popes and emperors of the West, offering church union again and again in exchange for military aid that rarely came. They sent gifts, letters, relics, anything that might win a promise of help. Yet time and again, when Ottoman armies closed in or Balkan princes threatened, the promised aid from the West was late, half-hearted, or absent altogether. The Byzantines, once masters of cunning diplomacy, now seemed beggars at the tables of others, offering their pride in exchange for protection. Meanwhile, a new danger rose across the straits. In Anatolia, the Ottomans expanded, a young dynasty filled with vigor and faith. They began as raiders, but within decades they were conquerors, swallowing the cities and valleys that had once been the empire's breadbasket. By the early 14th century, nearly all of Byzantine Asia was gone, and the empire was confined to its European half. Constantinople stood like an island in a rising Ottoman sea, cut off, isolated, and trembling. The emperors within the city must have felt the walls closing in year by year. They would have walked the ramparts at night, staring across the waters, where the fires of Ottoman camps glowed in the distance, each one a reminder of the noose tightening around their necks. They would have sat in the halls of the Blachernae Palace, listening to reports of villages lost, fortresses fallen, and allies who had defected or betrayed them. They would have heard the sermons of their priests, who urged faith in God's providence. Yet in their hearts, they must have known that providence alone could not turn back the tide. The people, too, felt the weight of despair. Constantinople's citizens grew weary of emperors who promised salvation through union with Rome, only to deliver humiliation. They whispered bitter sayings, "Better the Sultan's turban than the cardinal's hat." They meant it not as love for the Ottomans, but as hatred for Latin betrayal. The sack of 1204 had burned a wound too deep to heal, and many would rather bow to a Muslim ruler than endure another Western crusade dressed in the guise of aid. This bitterness split the empire from within, deepening the sense of division, eroding the last reserves of unity at the very moment they were most needed. Yet even as decline advanced, life continued. Markets still opened each morning, though smaller than before. Fishermen still cast their nets into the Bosphorus. Monks still chanted their prayers, candles flickering against mosaics that shimmered faintly in the dark. Children still played among the ruins, their laughter echoing against broken marble. History teaches us that decline is never a single moment, but a long twilight, where the ordinary rhythms of life continue beneath the shadow of approaching night. Byzantium lived in that twilight for 2 centuries after 1261, a city both alive and half dead, clinging to its walls even as the world beyond turned away. Emperor after emperor tried to halt the decay. Andronicus II cut expenses, but in so doing he dismantled the navy, leaving the empire vulnerable at sea. His son, Andronicus III, rallied briefly, winning battles, reclaiming some ground, but his reign was short. Civil wars followed. Father against son, cousin against cousin, soldiers marching under rival banners, while the Ottomans and Serbs advanced unchecked. The empire consumed itself in these quarrels, the smoke of its burning villages rising into the same sky that watched its own armies fight each other for scraps. And yet, Constantinople endured. Its walls, mighty as ever, stood against countless sieges. Its spirit, though weary, refused to die. To live in the city in these years was to carry a dual identity, to know oneself as both the heir of emperors and the subject of decline, to walk streets lined with ruined houses and still believe, somehow, that one was a citizen of Rome. That strange duality, pride and despair, grandeur and poverty, glory and ruin, defined the late empire. It was a place where a beggar might sleep under a column carved for Constantine, where a fisherman's hut leaned against the marble wall of a palace, where the bells of Hagia Sophia rang out across empty squares. By the 14th century, the Ottomans had crossed into Europe, settling first in Gallipoli, then spreading into Thrace and Macedonia. The noose tightened. The Byzantines sent emissaries once more to the west, pleading for aid, promising union, begging for knights and ships. A crusade did come, in 1396, at Nicopolis, but it ended in disaster, the Western Knights crushed by the disciplined Ottoman armies. Another came in 1444 at Varna, and again the Ottomans triumphed. Each failure only deepened the despair. By the time the 15th century dawned, Constantinople stood nearly alone, surrounded by Ottoman lands, its population shrunken, its fields barren, its treasury nearly empty. And yet, the city still breathed. Fires still glowed in its hearths at night. Pilgrims still knelt before its relics. The emperor still held court in faded splendor. The forms of Roman ritual maintained even as their substance faded. A visitor walking through its streets in those days might have felt as though he wandered through a dream, where past and present blurred the ruins of empire, mingled with the stubborn endurance of a people who refused to vanish. Michael VIII had restored Constantinople, but what he restored was not the empire of old. He had bought time, not victory. The Paleologoi kept the city alive for 2 more centuries, clinging to their walls, bargaining with neighbors, fighting when they could, enduring when they could not. It was a twilight age, haunted by memories of greatness, shadowed by the inevitability of loss. The people of Constantinople must have sensed it, must have felt in their bones that they lived at the edge of history, that theirs was a world ending, that the sun was setting on Rome. But they lived on nonetheless. And perhaps that is the true wonder, that an empire so weakened, so fractured, so abandoned, could endure for 200 years more, long enough to see the Renaissance stir in the West, long enough to shape the destiny of the Ottomans, long enough to leave behind a legacy that even its conquerors could not erase. Constantinople lived, battered and diminished, but still Constantinople. Its walls still cast their shadow over the waters. Its domes still glimmered at dawn. A ghost, yes, but a ghost that walked for centuries, whispering reminders of the empire that would not die until the very end. The century after Michael VIII's triumphal entry into Constantinople was not one of renewal, but of unraveling. He had returned the city to Byzantine hands, but what he restored was fragile, hollowed, and increasingly unmanageable. His heirs would inherit not a revived empire, but a sinking ship, taking on water from every direction. And yet, in that slow collapse, there is something haunting, a great melancholy beauty, in the way the Byzantines clung to their fading legacy. They were the last heirs of Rome, even if the world no longer believed it. When Michael VIII died in 1282, the empire fell to his son Andronicos II, a man of quieter temperament, more monk than warrior. Where his father had schemed and fought, Andronicos preferred books, prayers, and the company of theologians. The people may have hoped for stability after the ruthless energy of Michael, but what they received was paralysis. The empire was bankrupt. The treasury could not pay for the fleets or mercenaries needed to defend its shrinking borders. Andronicos, searching for savings, made a fateful decision. He dismantled what little remained of the navy, leaving the empire's seas to be dominated by Venetians and Genoese. To some, it seemed like madness, a conscious surrender of the very element that had once made Byzantium invincible. But to Andronicos, it was necessity. Ships were expensive, soldiers too, and the empire had neither gold nor men to spare. He cut costs, and with those cuts, he also cut away the sinews of survival. In his reign, the Ottomans, newcomers, hardly more than another Turkish emirate, at first began to grow ominously strong. In 1299, a chieftain named Osman declared his independence, and his warriors began raiding deep into Byzantine lands. They were relentless, disciplined, driven by both zeal and hunger. Andronicos, too distracted with theological disputes and family feuds, could not stop them. One by one, Byzantine fortresses in Asia fell. By 1326, Bursa had been lost. By 1331, Nicaea itself, the old council city that had sheltered emperors in exile, was gone. Nicomedia followed in 1337. With those losses, Byzantium was severed from its Anatolian heartland forever. The fields and villages that had fed Constantinople for centuries were now Ottoman land. The empire was reduced to Thrace, a scattering of towns in Greece, and the city itself, a crown with no body. Meanwhile, the capital reflected the empire's poverty. Travelers described Constantinople as a shadow of itself. The great walls still stood, but inside them, whole quarters were empty, houses collapsed, gardens overrun with weeds. Markets were thin, their stalls filled with cheap goods from Italian merchants rather than the luxurious fabrics and spices of old. Monks still chanted in Hagia Sophia, but the treasury could barely afford repairs to keep the dome from leaking. The once dazzling empire was fading before the eyes of its own people, like a candle guttering at the end of its wick. And then came division. Byzantium had always been prone to civil wars, but in the 14th century they multiplied, draining what little strength remained. Andronikos II quarreled bitterly with his grandson, Andronikos III, and the empire split into factions. Cities declared for one or the other, armies marched, and villages burned not by Turks this time, but by fellow Romans. At times, Serbs or Bulgarians were invited into the conflict as allies, plundering as they pleased. In one infamous decision, John VI, Kantakouzenos, a powerful general and later emperor, invited Ottoman mercenaries into Europe to aid his cause. In 1345, Turkish horsemen rode across the straits not as raiders but as allies of one Byzantine faction against another. It was a moment of short-sighted desperation, like inviting wolves into the sheepfold. The Ottomans quickly realized how weak their supposed employers were. They settled in Gallipoli in 1354, taking advantage of an earthquake that toppled its walls, and refused to leave. From that bridgehead they spread like fire through Thrace, and no emperor could drive them back. The empire bled from within. Civil wars lasted years, devastating the countryside. Farms were abandoned, villages burned, roads unsafe for trade. The treasury shrank to almost nothing, and emperors pawned relics from churches just to pay mercenaries who switched sides with the winds. The people grew weary, crushed between enemy raids and their own rulers' ambitions. Many began to say bitterly that the empire would have been better off if Michael had never retaken Constantinople at all. What had been won with such triumph in 1261 seemed now a hollow Pyrrhic victory. As if war were not enough, plague descended. In 1347, the Black Death swept into Constantinople. Ships carried it across the Mediterranean, rats spread it through the alleys, and within months, death was everywhere. Corpses piled in the streets, the air thick with smoke from funeral pyres. Some chroniclers claimed half the population perished. The once crowded capital fell eerily silent, its remaining citizens too few to fill the vast streets. Families locked themselves in their homes, afraid of neighbors, afraid even of priests who came to give last rites. The empire, already crippled by war and poverty, staggered under the weight of pestilence. It was as if God himself had turned away. And yet, even in these dark times, Byzantium refused to die. Andronikos III, despite inheriting an empire on its knees, fought to restore some strength. He reconquered parts of Greece, secured victories against rivals, and briefly gave the people hope. He was young, energetic, ambitious, a new Basil, some whispered, but his reign was short. He died in 1341, and with his death, hope died too. The civil war between John V. Palaiologos and John V. Kantakouzenos tore the empire apart for another decade. By the time John V. finally secured the throne, Byzantium was little more than Constantinople and a patchwork of outlying towns. Imagine what it must have been like for the ordinary people in these years. They lived in the shadow of walls that had once defied the world, but inside those walls there was hunger, poverty, and fear. They watched emperors change, not through peaceful succession, but through coups and betrayals. They heard news of towns lost to Turks, of Serbs conquering Macedonia, of Venetians and Genoese carving out colonies along their coasts. They saw Italian merchants growing rich, while Byzantine craftsmen went hungry. They listened to priests argue over union with Rome, while their own families starved. Life must have felt like waiting for an inevitable storm, a storm that had been gathering for generations. By the late 14th century, the Ottomans had taken Adrianople and made it their European capital. From there, they advanced relentlessly. In 1389, at Kosovo, they crushed the Serbian army, securing their dominance in the Balkans. The road to Constantinople lay open, and though the city still stood behind its walls, it was a lonely island in an Ottoman sea. The emperor was reduced to paying tribute to the Sultan, traveling to his court as a supplicant rather than a sovereign. The man who wore the crown of Constantine was now little more than a vassal dependent on Ottoman mercy. And yet, the Byzantines still clung to ceremony, to dignity, to the old forms of empire. In the crumbling palaces of Constantinople, court rituals were maintained. Emperors still processed in golden robes, still sat upon the throne, still issued decrees in the name of Rome. Hagia Sophia still echoed with chants. Its dome still glittered with mosaics. The empire may have been dying, but it refused to abandon its soul. That refusal, stubborn, proud, tragic, defined the twilight of the emperors. The Ottomans tightened the noose year by year. Gallipoli, Thrace, Macedonia all fell. The empire dwindled to the capital, parts of the Morea, and a few scattered ports. It was a ghost of empire, yet even ghosts have power in memory. For the people of Constantinople, every day became both a survival and a vigil. They looked east to the rising crescent of the Ottomans, west to the Catholic princes who offered promises but little else, and inward to their faith, praying for deliverance that did not come. In those twilight years, Byzantium was less a state than a symbol, a god, flickering candle that had burned for over 1,000 years, now trembling against the wind. And though its light was dim, it still burned, stubbornly, magnificently, against the dark. By the late 14th century, Constantinople was no longer the proud, bustling queen of cities it had once been. It had become, instead, a solitary island, an isolated fortress encircled by the relentless tide of Ottoman power. The city still glittered from a distance, its domes and spires rising above the waters of the Bosphorus, but within, the signs of decay were everywhere. Streets that had once overflowed with traders now lay empty. The marketplaces where silks, spices, and jewels from the ends of the earth had once dazzled, foreign visitors were hushed, filled instead with the quiet shuffle of poverty. The walls still loomed mighty, the Theodosian fortifications standing as they always had, but inside them the empire had shrunk to little more than memories. The emperors of this age, men like John V. Palaiologos and his son Manuel II, understood with painful clarity that Byzantium could not survive alone. The Ottomans were too strong, their armies too vast, their determination unshakable. The Byzantines had neither soldiers nor silver enough to resist them. Their only hope lay in the West, in the Christian princes of Europe, men who shared their faith, or so it was assumed. But that assumption was fragile, and the reality far more bitter. For centuries, the Byzantine and Latin worlds had mistrusted one another. The schism of 1054 had divided their churches. The sack of Constantinople by the Fourth Crusade in 1204 had left wounds that never healed. To many Byzantines, the Latins were as much enemies as the Turks, heretics, who had desecrated their holy places and enslaved their people. To many Latins, the Byzantines were arrogant, treacherous, and unworthy of aid. And yet, necessity drives even the proudest to compromise. In 1369, Emperor John V, worn down by the empire's exhaustion and pressed hard by the Ottomans, did what had once been unthinkable. He traveled west, to Rome itself. Imagine the spectacle, the heir of Constantine, the man who still bore the title of Roman emperor, making the long journey to kneel before the Pope. John V, desperate for aid, accepted the supremacy of the Roman pontiff and professed union of the churches. He, the emperor of orthodoxy, bowed to the head of the Latin Church in the hope that armies and gold would follow. For John, it was an act of survival, but to many of his people, it was an act of betrayal. They whispered that it was better to wear the turban of the Sultan than the hat of a cardinal. The old bitterness, stoked by memory of 1204, burned bright. And when John returned to his city, he brought no armies with him, no fleets to defend the Bosphorus. The West had applauded his humility, but offered little more than words. Still, the appeals continued. Manuel II, a more energetic and charismatic ruler, tried again. In 1399 he traveled across Europe, a wandering emperor pleading his cause before kings and princes. He went to Venice, to Paris, even as far as London, a sight that must have bewildered the English court. A Roman emperor, clad in the silks of Byzantium, speaking of a city they knew only from distant legend. He was received with courtesy, sometimes with sympathy, but rarely with commitment. Europe was torn by its own conflicts. The 100 Years' War raged between England and France. Italy was fractured by rival city-states. The papacy itself was divided by schism, two popes vying for obedience. In such a fractured Christendom, who had time or will to rescue Constantinople? Manuel returned home with promises and gifts, but no grand crusade. Still, there were attempts. In 1396, a crusade was assembled, led by French and Hungarian knights, and marched into the Balkans to strike at the Ottomans. It ended in disaster at Nicopolis, where the Sultan Bayezid crushed the proud chivalry of the West. Thousands were slain, thousands more captured. The flower of European knighthood perished on the banks of the Danube, and with them perished the illusion that a great crusade could turn back the tide. Constantinople rejoiced briefly when news of the crusade's launch had arrived, but its people mourned when they heard of its destruction. The West, they realized, could bleed too, and the Ottomans were stronger than anyone had feared. Through the first half of the 15th century, the pattern repeated. Emperors sent embassies, pleaded for aid, offered union. In 1439, at Florence, Emperor John VIII, Palaiologos, signed another act of union, again bowing to papal supremacy, again hoping that armies would follow. Once more, he returned home to a furious populace. The monks and priests denounced the union as heresy. The people spat upon it, and though the act of union had been written on parchment, in the hearts of Byzantines it was void, and once more no great armies arrived. A trickle of knights came, volunteers drawn by piety or adventure, but never enough. In 1444, one final effort was made. A crusade led by King Władysław of Poland and Hungary marched once again against the Ottomans, reaching Varna on the Black Sea. The armies were brave, their banners bright, their cause noble, but Mehmed's predecessor, Murad II, shattered them. King Władysław himself fell in battle, and his head, severed and displayed, became a symbol of Ottoman supremacy. The Crusade of Varna was the last gasp of Western Christendom's attempt to save Byzantium. After Varna, no great armies came east again. For Constantinople, these failures were devastating. Each crusade raised hopes, filled the churches with prayers, gave the people dreams of deliverance. Each defeat plunged them deeper into despair. By the mid-15th century, the city was alone, surrounded, impoverished, its emperors reduced to bargaining with merchants for ships and soldiers. The walls still stood, but behind them were fewer men to defend, fewer hands to mend the breaches. The union with Rome had brought division rather than strength. The West had moved on, concerned with its own rivalries, its own wars, and Byzantium seemed less a partner to save than a relic to be mourned. Yet still, the Byzantines endured. They lit candles in Hagia Sophia. They walked the crumbling streets. They sent their sons to stand on the walls with rusted armor and ancient swords. They believed, perhaps against all reason, that God might yet intervene. But as the 15th century drew toward its midpoint, the shadow of a new sultan fell across the horizon. Mehmed II, young, brilliant, and utterly determined, looked upon the city not as an ally, not as an enemy even, but as a destiny. He would do what no one before him had done. He would take Constantinople, and with it, the legacy of Rome. The appeals to the West had failed, the Crusades had been shattered, the Act of Union had divided rather than united. And so, as spring approached in the year 1453, the empire faced its last trial alone, a final stand beneath the ancient walls of the city of Constantine, a stand that would echo through the centuries. The spring of 1453 arrived with an air heavy with destiny. Across the Bosphorus, the meadows were greening, birds were returning, and the waters sparkled beneath the warming Sunday. But for the people of Constantinople, this renewal of nature carried with it no joy. It was instead a cruel reminder that time was moving forward, that seasons still turned, even as their empire teetered on the brink of annihilation. In the fields and harbors beyond the walls, a vast army gathered, its banners whipping in the breeze, its tents spreading like a sea of canvas across the plain. The Ottomans had come, and at their head stood Sultan Mehmed II, the 21-year-old ruler whose ambition burned brighter than the torches that lit his camp by night. Mehmed had prepared for this moment with the patience of a hunter and the determination of a conqueror. Since taking the throne, he had made the capture of Constantinople not just a goal, but the very essence of his reign. He understood the symbolic power of the city. To possess it was to claim the legacy of Rome, to show the world that his empire was not merely a sultanate among others, but the destined heir of centuries of imperial greatness. He had studied the failures of his predecessors and resolved that he would not falter as they had. Where others had tried and failed to breach the mighty Theodosian walls, he would bring to bear new weapons, new strategies, and a force of will so unrelenting that even the most impregnable of cities would yield. In Constantinople itself, the mood was somber but defiant. Emperor Constantine XI, Palaeologos, the last emperor of Byzantium, was not a man of great resources, nor one blessed with numerous armies, but he was a man of courage, and courage was the one currency left to spend. With perhaps 7,000 men under his command, Byzantines, mercenaries, and a small contingent of Genoese, led by Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, he prepared the city for the storm that was about to break. They inspected the walls, repaired crumbling sections, filled breaches with earth and timber, and prepared stockpiles of arrows, stones, and boiling oil. The great chain was stretched across the Golden Horn, sealing the harbor from intrusion. Fires were kindled in the workshops as blacksmiths hammered out weapons. Priests led processions through the streets, icons held high, incense wafting as hymns echoed among the ancient colonnades. The people prayed not only for deliverance, but for strength to face what seemed inevitable. Mehmed, meanwhile, gathered his arsenal. He had summoned master engineers to cast cannons of a size and power never before seen. Among them was the Hungarian founder Orban, who constructed the monstrous basilica cannon, a weapon so vast that it required scores of oxen to move and hundreds of men to operate. Its barrel stretched longer than a man, was tall many times over, and it could hurl stone balls weighing more than 1,000 pounds against the walls that had stood unbroken for centuries. Whether the gun was reliable or prone to cracking mattered little. It was a symbol of unstoppable force, a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. Alongside it came dozens of smaller cannons, mobile siege guns that could batter the fortifications day and night. The Ottoman army, estimated by some at over 100,000, spread across the land walls in a line that stretched farther than the eye could see. Infantry, cavalry, janissaries, sappers, and archers. This was not the ragged host of raiders that had once harried the empire's borders. This was a professional, disciplined force, organized with precision, led by commanders loyal to their young sultans. Their campfires glittered like stars at night, an ocean of light surrounding the city, reminding those on the walls that they were utterly alone. On April 6th, the siege began. The first thunder of cannon fire rolled across the plains, shaking the ground beneath the defenders' feet. Balls of stone crashed into the walls, sending showers of dust and splinters of masonry flying. Day after day, night after night, the bombardment continued. The Byzantines worked tirelessly to repair the breaches, filling the gaps with timber, earth, and whatever rubble they could gather. The noise of the cannons became a constant, a drumbeat of doom that marked the passing of time. Sleep was scarce, nerves frayed, but still they held. Inside the city, life continued in a strange twilight. Markets opened with what little goods remained. Bakers kneaded bread, mothers comforted children. At night, families huddled together, listening to the distant roar of cannon and the cries of the watchmen on the walls. Priests led vigils in Hagia Sophia, the golden mosaics glimmering in the lamplight as prayers rose into the vast dome. There was fear, yes, but also a kind of grim serenity. The people knew they stood at the end of 1,000 years of history. They were the last Romans, heirs to Constantine, Justinian, and Basil. To fall here would be a tragedy, but to surrender was unthinkable. Better to perish as free men and women, beneath their own banners, than to live as subjects of the conqueror. Mehmed, however, was relentless. He had ordered the construction of a massive fortress, Rumeli Hisari, on the Bosphorus before the siege, ensuring that no aid could come by sea from the Black Sea. He commanded his fleet to blockade the city from the water, sealing off escape and resupply. When the great chain across the Golden Horn barred his ships, he devised a plan of astonishing audacity. In one of the most remarkable feats of engineering in medieval history, he ordered his men to drag ships overland on greased logs, hauling them across hills and valleys to bypass the barrier. One morning, the defenders awoke to see Ottoman ships floating in the Golden Horn behind their walls, a sight so shocking it seemed almost a miracle of dread. The chain had held, but the enemy had found another way. As the weeks wore on, the defenders grew weary. The constant bombardment took its toll, and though they repaired the breaches nightly, the strain was immense. Food began to run low, morale wavered. Yet Emperor Constantine moved among his people, speaking to them, encouraging them, reminding them of the honor they bore. He fought beside them on the walls, not as a distant ruler, but as a comrade in arms. His presence gave them strength, and though despair lurked in every corner, his courage kept it at bay. The Ottomans launched several assaults, waves of men rushing the breaches, scaling ladders, battering gates. Time and again, they were hurled back by the desperate defenders. Arrows rained down, stones crashed from above, boiling oil seared the attackers. The Genoese commander, Giustiniani Longo, distinguished himself, leading sorties, directing repairs, and standing firm, even when wounded. His leadership inspired both his fellow Latins and the Byzantines who fought beside him. For a time, it seemed as though the city might yet endure, that perhaps the walls, the courage, and the prayers might hold against even this storm. But Mehmed had no thought of retreat. He knew the city's weaknesses, and he knew time was on his side. The Byzantines had no reinforcements coming, no hidden reserves of men or supplies. Each day that passed drained them further, while his own vast host remained supplied and ready. He pressed the bombardment harder, bringing his cannons ever closer, pounding the walls until cracks appeared that no repair could fully mend. His sappers tunneled beneath the earth, attempting to undermine the fortifications, though many of their efforts were foiled by the defenders' countermines. Still, the pressure grew, unceasing, irresistible. By late May, the city was nearing exhaustion. The walls bore gaping wounds, patched but fragile. The defenders were worn thin, their numbers dwindling, their hope dimming, and yet they did not yield. Each day was another miracle of resistance, another defiance of fate. The people prayed for deliverance, for a Western fleet to appear on the horizon, for some sign that God had not abandoned them. But the sea remained empty, the horizon barren. Mehmed prepared for his final assault. He rallied his men with promises of glory and plunder, declaring that Constantinople was theirs for the taking, that the prophet himself would bless their conquest. He promised 3 days of looting to the army, a prize beyond imagining. The soldiers, weary but eager, readied themselves for the storm. On May 28th, the last day of the empire, the city was filled with a strange and solemn calm. Processions wound through the streets, clergy carrying icons, chanting prayers. In Hagia Sophia, the emperor, nobles, and commoners gathered together in a final service, setting aside quarrels and divisions. Latin and Greek, unionist and anti-unionist, rich and poor, all came together beneath the vast dome, seeking strength in faith and unity in despair. Emperor Constantine received the Eucharist with his people, then rode out once more to the walls, where he would spend the last night of his life. The candles burned late into the night, prayers rose like smoke, and the city prepared to meet its fate. The dawn of May 29th, 1453, broke with a heavy stillness, as though even the winds of the Bosphorus hesitated to stir, sensing the enormity of the day. In the Ottoman camp, 100,000 soldiers rose to the trumpet's call, their armor glinting in the early light, banners snapping in the breeze, and the earth trembling beneath the shuffle of countless feet. The Sultan had ordered a final assault, and the men prepared themselves with grim determination and eager anticipation. For them, the city was more than just walls and towers. It was the gateway to eternal glory, the jewel of empires, the prize promised by their sultan, their prophet, and their ancestors who had failed before them. Inside Constantinople, the mood was very different. The defenders, few in number, gathered at their posts for what all knew was likely their last day on earth. The Emperor, Constantine XI, Palaiologos, clad in armor but without the imperial purple, moved among them, offering words of encouragement, clasping hands, and embracing comrades. He had no illusions. He did not promise victory, only honor. He reminded them that they were the guardians of a legacy, stretching back to Constantine the Great, the last stand of Rome itself. "Better to die in glory," he said, "than to live in shame." His words, though heavy, lit a spark in the weary defenders' hearts. The great bells of Hagia Sophia tolled at dawn, their deep notes echoing across the city one final time. Priests chanted hymns as processions wound through the streets. Citizens knelt, kissed icons, crossed themselves, and prayed fervently. Some carried relics through the neighborhoods, hoping for a miracle. Others whispered that angels would descend to defend the city, that Constantine himself, the first emperor, would rise from his tomb and lead them. Hope and despair mingled in equal measure, but above all, there was resignation. This was the day fate had chosen, and they would meet it with dignity. As the sun rose higher, the ground shook with the thunder of cannon. Mehmed's artillery roared to life, pounding the walls with relentless fury. Great stones smashed against towers, sections of masonry collapsed in clouds of dust. The basilica cannon, groaning and trembling with each shot, hurled its monstrous projectiles into the land walls, tearing open the breaches the defenders had struggled so desperately to repair. Smoke and fire filled the air, choking lungs, burning eyes. The noise was deafening, a continuous roar punctuated by the screams of the wounded and the shouted orders of captains. The first wave of attackers surged forward. These were the irregulars, the Bashi Bazouks, a motley host of mercenaries, adventurers, and conscripts. They stormed the breaches with wild cries, scaling ladders, battering gates, hurling stones and arrows. The defenders met them with arrows, boiling oil, and desperate courage. Stones crashed down, spears thrust, swords clashed. For hours, the Byzantines and their allies hurled back wave after wave, their courage shining like a flame against the storm. The ground outside the walls became littered with bodies, the ditches clogged with corpses. Yet still the attackers came, inexhaustible, endless. Behind them stood the Anatolian troops, more disciplined, more determined. They advanced in ordered ranks, filling the breaches with their sheer weight of numbers. Again, the defenders fought them back. Giustiniani Longo and his Genoese leading counterattacks with swords drawn, driving the enemy from the shattered walls. Giustiniani's presence was vital. His command, his experience, his bravery inspired the men around him, giving them strength to endure when their limbs trembled with fatigue. But fate dealt a cruel blow. Struck by a shot, whether by arrow, bullet, or cannon fragment, accounts differ. Giustiniani was gravely wounded. Bloodied and in agony, he begged to be carried from the field. As he was borne away, the defenders' morale plummeted. The sight of their strongest pillar of resistance leaving the line was like a dagger to the heart. Whispers spread. If the great Genoese could fall, what hope was left? The Ottomans saw the faltering and pressed harder. Mehmed himself urged his men on, promising glory, riches, and eternal paradise. He unleashed his janissaries, the elite of his army, disciplined, ruthless, and loyal to the last. They advanced in tight formation, shields raised, voices shouting in unison. Unlike the irregulars, these men did not break under fire. They pressed forward, step by step, forcing their way into the breaches. The defenders met them with desperate fury, but exhaustion and dwindling numbers began to tell. At the Kirkelporta gate, a small postern that had been carelessly left unsecured, or perhaps broken open in the chaos, Ottoman soldiers found their way inside. Whether by chance or design, this breach became the turning point. Once within the walls, they raised their banners, their shouts echoing through the city. Panic rippled among the defenders. If the enemy was inside, the walls no longer mattered. The line faltered, broke, and crumbled. The janissaries surged through, pouring into the city like a flood through a shattered dam. Emperor Constantine, seeing the collapse, refused to flee. Stripping off his imperial regalia, he is said to have cried, "The city is lost, but I live. Is there no Christian here to take my head?" Then, with sword in hand, he plunged into the melee, fighting alongside his men. He vanished into the chaos, never to be seen again. Some say his body was found among the fallen, others that he escaped into legend, turned to marble by angels to rise again when Constantinople is free. Whatever the truth, Constantine XI died as a soldier, a Roman, a defender of his people. His death marked the end of the empire he had sworn to protect. The city now lay open. Ottoman soldiers swarmed through the streets, their cries of triumph mingling with the screams of the terrified populace. Doors were broken down, homes looted, treasures seized. Fires broke out, spreading unchecked. The air filled with smoke, the stench of blood, the wails of the dying. In Hagia Sophia, thousands had gathered, praying desperately for deliverance. They barred the doors, clutched icons, and sang hymns. But the great bronze doors were broken, the janissaries stormed in, and the vast cathedral was defiled. Priests were cut down at the altar, women and children dragged away, sacred relics scattered. Within hours, the greatest church in Christendom was a mosque, its echoes forever changed. For 3 days, the sack continued, as Mehmed had promised. The city, once the jewel of the world, was reduced to ruin. Libraries burned, priceless manuscripts lost forever. Statues of bronze and marble were toppled, melted down, destroyed. Survivors were enslaved, marched off in chains, sold in markets. The once proud capital of the Roman Empire was now a shattered corpse. And yet, in its fall, it achieved a terrible immortality. On the 4th day, Mehmed entered the city. Riding through the broken gates, he beheld his prize at last. He dismounted at Hagia Sophia, where he ordered prayers offered to God. He proclaimed himself the new Caesar, heir to Rome, ruler of 2 continents and 2 seas. Constantinople was no more. In its place rose Istanbul, the heart of a new empire. Mehmed's triumph was complete. For Europe, the news of the city's fall was like a thunderclap. Bells tolled in, mourning. Kings and popes lamented. Poets wept. The last bastion of the ancient Roman world was gone, its 1,000-year legacy extinguished in a single day. Fear of Ottoman expansion gripped the West, and calls for crusade rose again. But no crusade came in time, and the balance of power had shifted forever. The Middle Ages were over. The modern world begun. For the people of Constantinople, there was no such grand perspective. For them, it was simply the end. Families broken, lives destroyed, faith shattered. Yet even in ruin, something endured. The mosaics, though defaced, still glimmered faintly in the candlelight. The chants of the Orthodox Church would continue even under Ottoman rule, and the memory of Byzantium, though trampled, would not vanish. It lived on in the dreams of exiles, in the monasteries of Mount Athos, in the courts of Russia, in the minds of Renaissance scholars who carried its books westward. The empire had fallen, but its spirit was not erased. The fall of Constantinople was not merely the end of a city, nor even an empire. It was the end of an age. The ancient world, sustained through Byzantium's long twilight, had finally yielded to the dawn of something new. Rome was gone, but its shadow would stretch endlessly across the centuries. When the thunder of cannons ceased, and the blood-soaked cries of May 29th faded into silence, Constantinople lay broken. Smoke rose in dark columns from its neighborhoods, drifting across the Bosphorus like black funeral veils. The once bright domes of churches stood charred, the marble avenues littered with corpses, the palaces plundered and empty. Yet within that ruin, history had turned. What ended in fire and blood was not only the Byzantine Empire, but an entire epoch of human civilization. For 3 days the sack continued, as Mehmed II had promised his men. Streets that had once hosted emperors and processions of priests now echoed with the tramp of boots and the wails of captives. Gold and silver, chalices and reliquaries, manuscripts and icons, all were seized, melted, sold, or destroyed. No one kept count of how many were slain, or how many were taken into slavery, though chroniclers speak of tens of thousands. Families were torn apart, homes burned, and the air carried both the stench of death and the cries of despair. Yet to the victors, this was triumph, the rightful reward for years of preparation and sacrifice, the realization of dreams that had eluded their forefathers for centuries. On the 4th day, when the frenzy subsided, Mehmed entered his new capital. He rode slowly through the gates, past shattered walls and heaps of rubble. The Sultan, only 21 years old, bore himself with the composure of a man twice his age. His soldiers cheered him, and his banners streamed proudly overhead, the crescent now flying where once the double-headed eagle had reigned. As he surveyed the ruined city, Mehmed is said to have murmured a line of Persian verse. The spider weaves the curtains in the palace of kings. The owl calls the watches in the towers of Afrasiab. Even in his triumph, he saw the impermanence of empire, the vanity of human ambition. Yet in the same breath, he resolved to rebuild this ruin into the jewel of his realm. His first destination was Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in Christendom, now silent and desecrated. Its doors, smashed open during the sack, still bore the marks of axes. Inside, the air was heavy with smoke and incense, the mosaics dimmed by dust, the altar stripped bare. Survivors huddled in corners, slaves awaiting their fate. Mehmed dismounted, walked across the marble floor, and ordered a cleric to climb the pulpit and proclaim the name of Allah. Thus, in a single gesture, Hagia Sophia was transformed into a mosque. Its 1,000 years of Christian worship suddenly ended. Yet Mehmed forbade its destruction. He saw in its dome and walls not merely a prize, but a symbol of empire, a monument to be preserved and repurposed. In this act, Hagia Sophia became both a trophy and a cornerstone, embodying the strange continuity between conqueror and conquered. The city that Mehmed claimed was no longer the Constantinople of Justinian or Basil II. Its population, once numbering in the hundreds of thousands, had dwindled to a fraction of that by the 15th century. Its markets, once bustling with goods from India, Africa, and the steppes of Asia, now stood empty. Its palaces, long neglected, were shells of faded grandeur. The Latin sack of 1204 had already crippled it. The civil wars of the 14th century had drained it further. By 1453, Constantinople was a shadow. Mehmed inherited not the crown jewel of empires past, but a ruin waiting for resurrection. Yet he understood its potential. He declared it his new capital, renaming it Istanbul, and immediately set about repopulating it. He invited Greeks, Armenians, Jews, and Muslims alike to settle there, granting privileges and exemptions to encourage migration. Slowly, painfully, the city began to breathe again. For the survivors of the Byzantine elite, there was no such revival. The emperor was dead, his body never truly identified. The court had scattered, its treasures looted, its palaces burned. A few nobles escaped by ship to the Morea or to Trebizond, clinging to scraps of imperial dignity. Others were dragged in chains to serve new masters. The Patriarchate of Constantinople, long the spiritual heart of orthodoxy, was humiliated but not destroyed. Mehmed, understanding the utility of religion, appointed a new patriarch, granting him authority over the city's Orthodox flock. By making the patriarch his subject, he both appeased his Greek population and asserted his dominance. Thus, the Church survived, though under the shadow of the crescent rather than the protection of the cross. To the wider Christian world, the fall was a cataclysm. When news reached Rome, Pope Nicholas V wept and declared it the greatest tragedy of Christendom. Bells tolled across Europe, sermons thundered from pulpits, and calls for crusade echoed in cathedrals. Yet the response was muted, half-hearted, fragmented. The kingdoms of Europe were embroiled in their own wars, England and France still licking wounds from the 100 Years' War, the German states divided, the papacy itself weakened by internal strife. No grand army assembled to avenge Constantinople. There were lamentations, there were vows, but no crusade came. The city had fallen, and Europe could only mourn. Yet from the ashes of Byzantium came an unintended gift. In the decades before and after the fall, scholars fled the collapsing empire, carrying with them manuscripts, knowledge, and traditions preserved in Constantinople's libraries. They journeyed westward to Italy, to Florence and Venice, to Rome and beyond. With them came the works of Plato and Aristotle, long neglected in the Latin West. They brought Euclid and Ptolemy, Galen and Hippocrates, Sophocles, and Thucydides. These treasures, preserved for centuries by Byzantine scribes, now found eager hands among Italian humanists. The Renaissance, already stirring, was fed by this influx of ancient wisdom. In the death of Byzantium, the seeds of Europe's rebirth were sown. Historians argue whether the Renaissance would have blossomed without this migration, but few deny the profound influence of Byzantine scholars. Men like George Gemistos Plethon, who lectured in Florence, inspired thinkers to rediscover Platonic philosophy. Cardinal Bessarion, a Byzantine-turned-Catholic, donated his vast library to Venice, laying foundations for modern scholarship. Even the invention of printing, spreading just decades later, multiplied these works, ensuring their survival and circulation. Thus, while Constantinople burned, its spirit leapt across seas and mountains, igniting a new age of art, science, and philosophy. The Slavic world, too, felt Byzantium's echo. Russia, long Orthodox, saw in the fall of Constantinople not only tragedy but opportunity. Moscow's rulers began to speak of themselves as heirs to Rome, proclaiming their city the Third Rome. The marriage of Ivan III to Sophia Palaiologina, niece of the last Byzantine emperor, cemented this claim. The double-headed eagle, once the emblem of Byzantium, became Russia's symbol, carried forward into a new empire. In this way, Byzantium did not vanish. It migrated, transformed, and endured in unexpected forms. And what of the Ottomans? For them, the conquest was both culmination and beginning. Mehmed styled himself not merely Sultan but Kaisari Rum, Caesar of Rome. He saw himself as successor to Constantine and Augustus, ruler of an empire that now spanned both Asia and Europe. By taking Constantinople, he gave his realm a capital worthy of its ambitions, a city at the crossroads of continents, commanding trade routes, controlling seas. Istanbul would flourish under Ottoman rule, its population swelling, its markets revived, its skyline adorned with new mosques and palaces. The conqueror's dream was not only to destroy but to build, to take the bones of Byzantium and raise upon them a new dominion. Still, for those who loved the old empire, the grief was unending. Greek poets and chroniclers wrote dirges for the lost city, mourning its beauty, its grandeur, its sanctity. Legends grew that the emperor had not died but slept beneath the Golden Gate, awaiting the day when he would rise to reclaim his throne. that angels had hidden treasures deep within Hagia Sophia to be revealed when the city returned to Christian hands. The people clung to these myths, for in them lay comfort, a promise that defeat was not eternal, but reality was harsher. The Empire of Trebizond, last Byzantine outpost on the Black Sea, fell in 1461. The despotate of the Morea, ruled by Constantine's brothers, collapsed soon after. One by one, the fragments of Byzantium were extinguished, until only memory remained. The thousand-year story that had begun with Constantine the Great, that had seen Justinian, Heraclius, Basil, and so many others, was now closed. The last page was written, the book shut. Yet the echoes lingered. The fall of Constantinople was more than the end of a city or empire. It was a hinge of history, a dividing line between ages. It signaled the final death of the ancient world, the triumph of gunpowder over stone, the rise of new powers and new ideas. It reshaped trade, redirecting Europe toward the seas and the voyages of Columbus and Vasco da Gama. It redefined the balance of power, with the Ottomans now dominant in the east, their shadow falling over Vienna and the Mediterranean. It transformed religion, deepening the schism between East and West, and planting seeds of fear and rivalry that would endure for centuries. And yet, in the quiet hours, in monasteries and churches, in libraries and palaces, Byzantium lived on. Its art, its music, its theology, its vision of empire, all these survived, woven into the fabric of nations far beyond its borders. To walk today, beneath the domes of street marks in Venice, or to hear the liturgy sung on Mount Athos, is to glimpse Byzantium's ghost. To see the onion domes of Moscow, the icons of Serbia, the mosaics of Ravenna, is to hear its whisper. And to stand in Hagia Sophia, whether as church, mosque, or museum, is to feel its presence, eternal, unbroken, though transformed. Thus, the ashes of Byzantium gave rise to echoes that still resound. The city was lost, the empire destroyed, but the idea of Rome, of Constantinople, of a Christian empire straddling worlds, endures in memory and imagination. On that day in 1453, a world ended, but in its ending, new worlds began. When the walls of Constantinople finally fell, and the Ottomans planted their crescent over Hagia Sophia, it seemed as though 1,000 years of history had been extinguished in a single night. But history is not so easily silenced. An empire may perish, its armies scattered, its rulers slain or enslaved, but its culture, its art, its faith, and its ideas have a stubborn way of surviving. Byzantium, though buried under the weight of Ottoman conquest, did not truly vanish. It lingered like twilight after sunset, its glow faint but enduring, casting long shadows across centuries. In this twilight, the empire became something more than territory and rulers. It became memory, legend, and legacy, shaping worlds far beyond its borders. Imagine for a moment walking through the burned streets of Constantinople just days after the 29th of May 1453. The marble colonnades are blackened, their statues toppled. Churches that once resounded with hymns stand silent or desecrated, their mosaics dimmed by soot. The once grand palace of the Blachernae lies in ruins, its halls stripped bare. The empire itself has vanished, its institutions shattered. And yet, even amid the rubble, its essence lingers. In the whispers of prayers muttered in ruined chapels, in the manuscripts hidden under robes by fleeing monks, in the melodies of Byzantine chant carried away by refugees, the empire lives on. What was lost in stone and sword endured in spirit. One of Byzantium's greatest gifts to posterity was its art. Byzantine art was never about naturalism in the way Western art pursued it. It did not strive to imitate the human body with anatomical precision, or to capture landscapes with earthly realism. Instead, Byzantine art sought the eternal. Its figures, elongated and solemn, their faces luminous, their eyes impossibly large, were not portraits of mortals but windows to the divine. Icons, mosaics, and frescoes were meant to transport the viewer, to remind them of heaven even while standing on earth. The conquest could plunder churches and smash statues, but the style itself had already spread far beyond Constantinople. In Orthodox lands, Russia, Serbia, Bulgaria, and beyond, the Byzantine aesthetic became the very language of devotion. Long after the empire fell, churches still glowed with golden mosaics, and icons painted in the Byzantine style still drew believers into silent communion with the divine. Consider Hagia Sophia, jewel of Justinian's ambition. Its dome seemed to float on light, suspended between heaven and earth. When the Ottomans converted it into a mosque, they covered its mosaics with plaster, but they did not destroy the building. Its architecture was too magnificent, too commanding to discard. Instead, it inspired a new flowering of Ottoman architecture. The great mosques of Istanbul, designed by master builders like Sinan, owe their grandeur to Byzantine precedent. Each soaring dome, each cascade of semi-domes, each wide, luminous prayer hall, these were children of Hagia Sophia, born from its shadow. Thus, Byzantine architecture lived on, even as its faith was suppressed. The conquerors became its students, the very stones teaching lessons across centuries. Beyond architecture and art, Byzantium preserved something perhaps even more precious: knowledge. In its libraries and monasteries, scribes labored for centuries to copy and preserve the works of antiquity. Aristotle and Plato, Euclid and Galen, Homer and Thucydides. Without Byzantine preservation, much of classical Greece would have been lost forever. The West, fragmented after Rome's fall, had forgotten much of this inheritance. But Byzantium, proud of its Hellenic roots, guarded it like a sacred flame. When refugees fled the collapsing empire in the 15th century, they carried these manuscripts westward. Their arrival in Italy fed the hungry minds of humanists, sparking a renaissance of learning and art. Imagine a scholar in Florence, opening for the first time a newly arrived manuscript of Plato's dialogues, written in Greek and preserved for centuries in Constantinople. The ink, though faded, still carried the voice of antiquity, a voice Byzantium had guarded through storms of history. In this way, even as the empire fell, it gifted Europe the very fuel for its rebirth. The Slavic world bore Byzantium's imprint in even deeper ways. Centuries before the fall, Byzantine missionaries Cyril and Methodius had carried Christianity northward, inventing the alphabet that became Cyrillic, translating scriptures into Slavonic, and planting the seeds of a great Orthodox commonwealth. When Constantinople collapsed, Moscow stepped into the role of protector of orthodoxy. The marriage of Ivan III to Sophia Palaeologina, niece of the last Byzantine emperor, gave Russia not only blood ties to the fallen empire but also a potent ideology. Moscow was proclaimed the Third Rome, heir to Rome and Constantinople alike. The double-headed eagle, once imperial symbol of Byzantium, was adopted as Russia's own. In this way, Byzantium's authority and legacy did not die. It migrated, reshaping itself in Slavic lands, enduring in new forms long after the walls of Constantinople had crumbled. Religion was perhaps Byzantium's most enduring legacy. The Orthodox Church, though shaken by the conquest, survived. Under Ottoman rule, the ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople was allowed to remain as leader of the Orthodox millet, overseeing the empire's Orthodox Christians. Though humbled and controlled, the Church endured, preserving the liturgy, the theology, and the traditions that had been shaped in Byzantium. To walk into an Orthodox church even today is to step into a world crafted by Byzantium. The flicker of candles against golden icons, the fragrance of incense curling toward the dome, the chants echoing with solemn cadence. These are living echoes, unbroken chains, connecting worshippers across centuries to the faith of Byzantium. Yet Byzantium's twilight was not only spiritual, it also lived on in memory, in the stories whispered among Greeks for generations. Legends spread of the last emperor, Constantine XI, who did not truly die but was hidden by angels beneath the Golden Gate, waiting for the day he would rise and reclaim his city. Folk songs mourned Constantinople's fall, casting it as both tragedy and prophecy. The phrase, "better the Sultan's turban than the cardinal's hat," captured the bitterness of a people caught between Western betrayal and Eastern conquest, their faith unyielding even in defeat. These myths, born of sorrow, became threads of identity, sustaining hope through centuries of Ottoman rule. In the West, the memory of Byzantium was more conflicted. Long mistrusted by Latin Christendom, Byzantium was often caricatured as decadent, scheming, and effeminate, a shadow of Rome. The very word Byzantine became synonymous with intrigue and corruption. Yet this caricature ignored the empire's resilience, its contributions to law, art, and theology. Only in recent centuries have historians begun to restore Byzantium to its rightful place. Not a mere afterthought to Rome, but a thousand-year empire that bridged antiquity and the modern age. In this re-evaluation lies another echo of Byzantium, how its image has shifted, reflecting not only its own history, but also the prejudices and needs of those who judged it. The Ottomans themselves carried Byzantium's legacy, even as they sought to replace it. Mehmed II called himself Caesar of Rome, and his successors embraced the role of emperors ruling from the heart of Constantinople. They inherited not only the city but also its bureaucracy, its ceremonies, even fragments of its legal traditions. In the great Topkapi Palace, echoes of Byzantine court rituals survived, transformed but recognizable. The conquerors had become heirs, weaving themselves into the lineage of empire they had destroyed. In this paradox lies the strange endurance of Byzantium. It lived on even in those who claim to have ended it. Centuries later, as Europe industrialized and modern states rose, Constantinople remained a symbol. To Greeks, it was the city, their lost capital, the dream of liberation. To Russians, it was the holy city they long aspired to reclaim. To Western travelers, it was an exotic marvel, a crossroads of East and West. And to the Ottomans, it was the proud jewel of their empire, a capital that rivaled Rome itself. In each of these visions, Byzantium lived on, its ghost haunting imagination, politics, and faith alike. Even in the modern world, the empire whispers, Hagia Sophia, changing hands between church, mosque, and museum, stands as a monument to contested memory. Each transformation reflects ongoing struggles over identity, faith, and history. Scholars still debate Byzantium's role in shaping Europe, in defending Christendom from invasion, in preserving antiquity, in influencing Islamic architecture, in forging Orthodox identity. Its reputation has shifted with each century, yet it has never disappeared. Like twilight, it lingers, neither day nor night, its outlines blurred but unmistakable. And so, in its long twilight, Byzantium became more than empire. It became a legacy, a bridge, a reminder that history does not end with conquest. Its domes still inspire, its icons still gleam, its chants still rise, its manuscripts still teach. Even now, to read its chronicles, to stand beneath its arches, to hear its hymns, is to feel the presence of something vast, something eternal. Empires may fall, cities may burn, but culture, faith, and memory endure. In that endurance lies Byzantium's true triumph. The twilight of Byzantium was not the darkness of oblivion, but the glow of embers, scattered yet still warm, lighting paths in distant lands, inspiring generations unknown to those who had fought and fallen at the walls. From Moscow's domes to Florence's libraries, from Istanbul's mosques to the villages of Greece, those embers smoldered, shaping worlds that outlived the empire itself. In them, Byzantium remained immortal, not in power, but in presence, not in armies, but in memory. And in memory, perhaps, it will never die. When Constantinople's walls finally fell in 1453, the clash of sword against shield, the thunder of cannon, and the cries of the dying marked the end of a political order. Yet beneath that noise, there was another story, quieter but no less profound. In libraries, in monasteries, and in the hands of fleeing scholars, an inheritance was being carried out of the ruins. It was not gold or jewels, but something far more enduring: knowledge. The Byzantine Empire, throughout its long existence, had acted as the bridge between antiquity and the modern world, the custodian of Greek and Roman learning. It was this role, more than armies or fortresses, that secured Byzantium's immortality. Picture a dimly lit scriptorium within the walls of Constantinople, centuries before the fall. Monks bend over parchment, their quills scratching softly as candles flicker. Before them are the words of Plato, Aristotle, Sophocles, Galen. Every stroke is an act of devotion, not merely to faith but to civilization itself. Outside, empires rise and crumble, enemies march and retreat. But inside these rooms, a quiet battle is being fought against oblivion. To copy a book in Byzantium was not simply clerical work. It was preservation, resurrection, an effort to keep alive voices that might otherwise be swallowed by time. After the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, much of Latin Europe slipped into centuries where learning dimmed. Cities shrank, schools faltered, libraries burned. But in the East, where Constantinople's walls held firm, the heritage of Greece and Rome endured. Byzantium saw itself not only as Christian empire but as heir to Hellenic wisdom. The works of Homer were read by children. Aristotle's logic trained theologians and jurists. Galen's medical texts guided physicians. Even emperors prided themselves on philosophy and rhetoric. This deep reverence meant that for 1,000 years, Byzantium became a living library, a vault of ideas that might otherwise have vanished forever. Consider, for a moment, the manuscripts that Byzantium preserved. Without Byzantine scribes, we might never have known the tragedies of Sophocles or Euripides, the comedies of Aristophanes, the histories of Herodotus and Thucydides. It was Byzantium that copied and recopied Euclid's geometry, Ptolemy's astronomy, Hippocrates' medicine. They did not preserve everything. Many works were lost, despite their efforts. But what they did save formed the foundation of modern science, literature, and philosophy. To imagine a world without these voices is to imagine a world immeasurably poorer, a world deprived of its own past. The preservation was not passive. Byzantine scholars did not merely copy texts, they commented, critiqued, and compiled. Patriarch Photius, in the 9th century, created the Bibliotheca, a massive survey of ancient works, many of which survive to us only through his summaries. Michael Psellos, in the 11th century, revived interest in Plato, weaving philosophy into politics and theology. Eustathius of Thessalonica wrote expansive commentaries on Homer, illuminating the epics for new generations. Each scholar became a link in a chain stretching from antiquity into the present. Their efforts were acts of continuity, threads of memory woven into the fabric of empire. The chain held until the final crisis. As the Ottomans advanced, as the empire shrank to a shadow, the guardians of memory faced a desperate task. What could be saved? What could be carried west? Fleeing scholars became couriers of civilization. Bessarion, a Byzantine cardinal who had embraced union with Rome, carried his library of Greek manuscripts to Venice, where it became a cornerstone of the city's intellectual life. George Gemistos Plethon, a philosopher steeped in Platonic thought, inspired Italian humanists at the Council of Florence, his ideas echoing in the works of Marsilio Ficino and the Platonic Academy of Florence. John Argyropoulos taught Greek in Italy, training a generation of scholars who would spread Hellenic wisdom across Europe. Imagine the scene. A scholar, weary from travel, disembarks in Venice or Florence. He carries under his cloak a manuscript, perhaps the dialogues of Plato, perhaps a medical treatise, perhaps a collection of poems. To him it is treasure beyond measure. To the Italians who receive it, it is revelation. Here are words not filtered through Latin translations, but in their original Greek brilliance. For the first time in centuries, Western scholars could hear the authentic voice of antiquity. The effect was electric. The Renaissance, that flowering of art, science, and philosophy, owed much to this Byzantine exodus. Petrarch and Boccaccio had yearned for Greek texts, but it was the fall of Byzantium that truly opened the floodgates. With Greek manuscripts pouring into Italy, a new humanism took root. Painters studied classical forms, architects revived ancient proportions, philosophers rediscovered Plato and Aristotle. The very DNA of Renaissance culture carried Byzantine strands. Without the guardians of memory, the Renaissance would have been a pale shadow of itself. But Byzantium's role was not limited to preservation and transmission. Its own intellectual life had been vibrant and creative. The empire fostered advances in law, theology, diplomacy, and even science. Byzantine jurists compiled and adapted Roman law, producing the Basilica, a monumental legal code that shaped later European law. Theologians debated Christology in councils whose decisions still define Christian doctrine. Astronomers charted the stars. Doctors treated patients with Galenic medicine enriched by centuries of practice. Engineers built aqueducts, domes, and war engines. These were not mere copyists, but active participants in the unfolding of human knowledge. Consider again the paradox: a state often described as stagnant, decadent, in decline, and yet it preserved the very texts that allowed others to leap forward. It is as though Byzantium, exhausted by centuries of wars and sieges, still mustered the strength to pass on the torch before collapsing. Its death was, in some ways, a gift, for in scattering its scholars, it fertilized the soil of Renaissance Europe. The story is not without irony. Many Byzantines themselves distrusted the West, remembering the horrors of the Fourth Crusade. Many resisted church union, even when it promised aid. And yet, when the empire fell, it was the West that inherited their wisdom. Byzantium's loss became Europe's gain. From Florence to Paris, from Oxford to Krakow, the manuscripts copied in Constantinople now formed the core of curricula, inspiring thinkers who would challenge dogma, chart new worlds, and spark revolutions of thought. And so, when we speak of the Renaissance as rebirth, we must also speak of Byzantium as midwife. Without its guardians of memory, there could have been no rebirth, no revival of antiquity. Byzantium, often maligned, often misunderstood, had in fact shaped the very world that replaced it. Even today, echoes of that guardianship remain. In libraries across Europe, precious manuscripts bear the marks of Byzantine scribes, Greek letters, marginal notes, careful diagrams. In the soaring domes of churches, one sees not only faith but the mathematics of geometry preserved by Byzantines. In the words of philosophers, one hears the voices of Greek sages, carried through centuries by the diligence of Byzantine scholars. The empire is gone, but its memory endures, not only in monuments and ruins, but in every book, every idea, every tradition it preserved. As the twilight deepened after 1453, and as the world shifted into the early modern age, Byzantium's guardians of memory had ensured that their civilization would never truly die. Their empire might have fallen, but their wisdom lived on, shaping worlds they would never see. And perhaps, in that endurance, lies the truest victory of Byzantium, the victory of memory over oblivion. When the armies of Sultan Mehmed II finally stormed through the battered gates of Constantinople in 1453, the last vestiges of the Roman Empire dissolved into the tide of history. But though the political and military framework of Byzantium crumbled under the Ottoman cannon fire, there was another empire less tangible, yet infinitely more enduring, that refused to vanish. This was the spiritual empire, the realm of Orthodox Christianity, nurtured and refined for more than 1,000 years within the marble walls, incense-laden churches, and echoing chants of Constantinople. It was a world of liturgy, theology, and mysticism that continued to live long after the emperors had fallen. The Byzantines had always believed themselves chosen custodians of divine truth, defenders of an authentic faith that reached back to the apostles themselves. And though their capital was conquered, the rhythms of their spiritual life would ripple outward, influencing lands as far-flung as Russia, Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania, and beyond, shaping the religious identity of millions. and securing Byzantium's place as one of the most enduring architects of the Christian imagination. Imagine, if you will, walking into the Hagia Sophia in its prime, long before its conversion into a mosque or a museum, when it was the beating heart of the Byzantine religious experience. The first sensation would not be sight but sound. The deep, resonant tones of the choir, chanting in ancient Greek, words that floated like incense itself into the vast dome above. The music, devoid of instruments, carried only by the human voice, seemed to erase the boundary between heaven and earth. This was the divine liturgy of street. John Chrysostom, perfected across centuries, a service that transformed time and space into a vision of the eternal. For the Byzantines, worship was not simply ritual, it was the reenactment of cosmic truth. The church itself was designed to feel like a model of heaven. The dome, luminous with golden mosaics, represented the firmament above, while the glittering icons of Christ Pantocrator, the Virgin, and the saints reminded worshippers that they were surrounded by an unseen cloud of witnesses. It was here that the emperor, standing beside the patriarch, appeared less as a mere ruler of men and more as a chosen steward of God's kingdom on earth. This was symphonia, the Byzantine idea of harmony between church and state. The emperor and patriarch were meant to be twin guardians of the faith, working together in unity, though, in reality, their relationship often descended into rivalry and tension. Still, this vision defined Byzantine spirituality. A world where heaven and earth were intertwined, where political authority and religious conviction were fused into one tapestry. The Byzantine Empire's theology was not merely about abstract doctrines, though it produced some of the most intricate debates in Christian history. It was also about experience, about cultivating the presence of God in daily life. Take, for instance, the monks of Mount Athos, who even today continue the unbroken tradition of Byzantine spirituality. For centuries, they sought to perfect the practice of hesychasm, a form of contemplative prayer in which the worshipper repeated the simple words, "Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner," over and over again, until the heart itself seemed to pray without ceasing. They believed that through silence, fasting, and constant prayer, one might behold the uncreated light of God, the same light, they insisted, that had shone from Christ on Mount Tabor during the Transfiguration. This mystical theology, debated fiercely in Constantinople during the 14th century, became one of the crown jewels of Orthodox Christianity, and it survives today in Orthodox monasteries and prayer traditions across the globe. Yet the legacy of 15 Misses, Byzantine spirituality, was not confined to monasteries or elite theologians. It shaped the rhythms of every village and city that fell under its cultural influence. Consider the liturgical calendar, punctuated by feasts and fasts, weaving together the life of Christ and the saints with the life of the community. Easter, the Feast of Feasts, was celebrated with unmatched splendor, beginning with midnight processions, candles lit in the darkness, the words "Christ is risen" echoing joyfully across the city. Christmas, Epiphany, the Dormition of the Virgin, and countless saints' days structured the year. Even the humblest peasant or fisherman in Byzantine lands lived within this sacred rhythm, where time itself was sanctified and every day carried the memory of eternity. The Byzantines also left a profound mark through their missionary activity. Long before the fall of Constantinople, the empire had sent out apostles, not armed with swords, but with books, words, and liturgies. Two brothers, Cyril and Methodius, journeyed from Thessalonica into the lands of the Slavs in the 9th century, carrying not only the Christian faith, but also a gift of language. They created the Glagolitic alphabet, the precursor to Cyrillic, so that the Slavic peoples could hear the gospel and the liturgy in their own tongue. It was a revolutionary act of cultural generosity, one that ensured the deep Christianization of Russia, Bulgaria, Serbia, and other regions. The Slavs became not mere converts, but full participants in the Byzantine spiritual world, inheritors of its theology, its architecture, and its art. This gift would prove decisive after 1453, for though Constantinople itself fell, The torch of Byzantium was carried into the Slavic world. Moscow began to see itself as the Third Rome, the final guardian of orthodoxy, inheritor of the mantle of Constantinople. The Russian Tsars adopted Byzantine court rituals, Byzantine-style double-headed eagles, and Byzantine theological ideas of divine kingship. The Orthodox liturgy, virtually unchanged, continued to bind millions to the spiritual world of Byzantium. In a way, Byzantium never died. It simply shifted its center of gravity northward, embedding itself into the DNA of Eastern Europe and beyond. But what made Byzantine spirituality so unique, so different from the Latin Christianity of the West? Part of it was theological emphasis. Where Western Christianity often pursued rational clarity and legal categories, how sin was paid for, how grace was distributed, Byzantine Christianity reveled in mystery. The sacraments were not puzzles to be solved, but holy mysteries to be entered. The Eucharist was not dissected into theories of transubstantiation or symbolism. It was the living presence of Christ, received with awe. Icons, too, reveal this difference. In the West, art often sought realism, perspective, and naturalism. In Byzantium, icons deliberately avoided too much realism. They were windows into the eternal, flat, stylized, their golden backgrounds representing not earthly space, but the timeless light of heaven. To gaze upon an icon was to step into another dimension, to meet the holy face to face. This way of seeing and worshipping endured even in the darkest times. When Ottoman troops poured into Hagia Sophia in 1453, the last liturgy was said by priests and faithful who knew the end was near. According to legend, as the invaders burst into the sanctuary, the clergy carrying the Eucharist disappeared into the walls themselves, to remain there until the day Constantinople is restored. True or not, the legend captures the Byzantine conviction that the spiritual empire could never be extinguished by earthly conquest. The walls of stone could fall, but the invisible walls of faith endured, impervious to cannon or fire. The resilience of this spiritual legacy also rested in the monastic communities that carried on unbroken even after 1453. Mount Athos, that rugged peninsula bristling with monasteries, became a living museum of Byzantine spirituality. Its monks, sheltered by geography and occasionally by Ottoman tolerance, preserved manuscripts, chanted the same hymns, painted the same icons, and prayed the same prayers as their forebears in Constantinople. In their quiet, they kept alive the Byzantine heart, transmitting it to future generations. Even today, pilgrims stepping onto the shores of Athos feel as though they have walked backward through time, into a living remnant of Byzantium. There is also the question of how Byzantium influenced the broader Christian world. Western Europe, often disdainful of Greek ways, nonetheless absorbed Byzantine spirituality in unexpected ways. The great Gothic cathedrals of France, with their soaring vaults and glowing stained glass, were in some sense Western answers to the light-filled domes of Constantinople. The Renaissance humanists who rediscovered Plato and Aristotle did so largely through Byzantine manuscripts carried westward by exiled scholars. Even in theology, the West could not entirely ignore the mystical traditions of the East, which filtered slowly into Western monasticism and mysticism. But perhaps the most enduring gift of Byzantium's spirituality was its insistence on beauty as a pathway to God. In the West, theology sometimes became entangled in scholastic debate, precise definitions, and legal categories. In Byzantium, theology was sung, painted, and lived. Beauty itself was considered a form of truth. A peasant standing before an icon, or a noblewoman lighting candles in Hagia Sophia, was encountering the divine as surely as a theologian debating in the palace. The Byzantines believed that God revealed himself through light, color, sound, and sacred space. The faith was not merely taught, it was experienced, with all the senses. This approach ensured its survival. Empires may collapse, armies may conquer, but the memory of beauty endures. The Orthodox, liturgy today is recognizably the same as it was 1,000 years ago. The icons, with their timeless faces, still gaze out across churches in Greece, Russia, Serbia, and even far beyond. In the diaspora communities of America and Australia, the chants still rise, unchanged, echoing across centuries. This is the living legacy of Byzantium's spiritual empire: continuity, beauty, and mystery. As we drift deeper into this story, imagine that moment in 1453, when the last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, stood upon the walls of his doomed city. Perhaps he looked back one final time toward Hagia Sophia, its dome catching the first light of dawn, its bells tolling as priests prepared for the final liturgy. The empire would fall, but the faith that had given it life endured. The spiritual empire of Byzantium was not bound to stone or sword. It was bound to liturgy, to prayer, to icons, to the eternal memory of 1,000 years of devotion. And so it lived on, in every candle lit before an icon, in every chant of Christ is risen, in every Orthodox church where heaven and earth still meet in mystery. Even as you listen now, centuries later, the whispers of that empire reach you. The hymns still sing, the incense still rises, the light still glimmers on golden mosaics. Byzantium, though gone, has never really left us. It lives wherever beauty is seen as divine, wherever worship seeks to embrace mystery, and wherever the faithful gather to encounter eternity. And in that sense, the empire truly was eternal, not as a kingdom of this world, but as a kingdom of the Spirit, alive in the hearts and prayers of millions, stretching endlessly across the centuries, like a soft, unbroken chant echoing into the night. When the last emperor fell in battle, his purple cloak cast aside in the dust of Constantinople's streets, the world might have thought the story of Byzantium was finished. The walls had been breached, the mosaics desecrated, the throne of the Caesars overturned. Yet history is never so simple, for empires, unlike men, rarely die in a single hour. Their shadows stretch long across the centuries, seeping into the lives, the thoughts, and the creations of those who come after them. And Byzantium, though stripped of its armies and its palaces, though ruled over by foreign sultans, lingered with surprising resilience in the imagination of the world. Its cultural afterlife was not one of silence, but of echo. 1,000 resonances that continued to shape art, architecture, literature, and memory long after the political entity itself had perished. To understand this afterlife, we must first imagine the city of Constantinople, not as a battlefield, but as it was in its golden days, a city where art was everywhere, where the very stones seemed to glow with devotion and grandeur. In the great basilicas, mosaics shimmered like captured stars, their tiny tesserae of glass and gold, catching the candlelight in restless movement. Saints with solemn eyes gazed out from walls, not portraits of earthly likeness but symbols of eternal truth. The emperor's palace was hung with silks embroidered in deep crimson and imperial purple, fabrics coveted by merchants across Asia and Europe. In the hippodrome, the people gathered beneath statues of bronze and marble, relics of antiquity that spoke of Rome's might, yet reshaped by Byzantine hands into symbols of Christian triumph. This cultural world did not collapse into ash in 1453. Much of it was carried off by Venetians, by crusaders, by merchants, by refugees, and in being scattered, it was paradoxically preserved. Consider Venice, that restless maritime republic, a city built on water yet dreaming always of empire. For centuries, Venice had been a trading partner, rival, and imitator of Constantinople. Its own Basilica of San Marco is essentially a Byzantine church, transplanted to the lagoons, its domes, mosaics, and marble inlays echoing the style of Hagia Sophia. When the Dacian Crusaders of 1204 plundered Constantinople, countless treasures were dragged back to Venice. The bronze horses of the hippodrome, those ancient statues of imperial power, were mounted above the doors of San Marco, where they remain to this day. Chalices, relics, icons, all found new homes in Venetian treasuries. To wander Venice is, in a sense, to wander among fragments of Byzantium. And yet these fragments, though torn from their original context, kept alive the memory of Byzantine art, ensuring that its style and brilliance would inspire generations beyond its fall. The same is true of the wider Renaissance. When Byzantine scholars fled westward carrying manuscripts of Plato, Aristotle, Homer, and Euclid, they were not merely refugees, they were couriers of an ancient legacy. The libraries of Florence and Rome swelled with texts long forgotten in the Latin West, texts that Byzantine scribes had copied, preserved, and commented upon for centuries. It was as though a floodgate had opened, and the Renaissance thirst for antiquity was quenched with the waters of Byzantium's libraries. The works of Plato, which would shape Renaissance philosophy and Neoplatonism, survived because Byzantine scholars had cherished them. The mathematical treatises that guided architects and astronomers, the tragedies that influenced humanist drama, all these were gifts of Byzantium's long guardianship of classical heritage. Thus, even in defeat, Byzantium became a midwife to a rebirth. But the cultural afterlife of Byzantium is not merely about manuscripts and statues. It is about ideas, aesthetic principles, and ways of seeing the world. One of the most enduring is the Byzantine understanding of sacred space. To enter a church was not simply to step into a building. It was to step into heaven. Architecture was theology in stone and mortar. The dome symbolized the cosmos, the altar, the throne of God, the mosaics, the invisible cloud of saints. This vision of the sacred shaped not only Orthodox churches across the Balkans and Russia, but even seeped into Western architecture. When Renaissance and Baroque architects sought to awe their congregations with domes that seemed to float on air, they were, knowingly or not, following paths first walked in Constantinople. St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, with its massive dome, owes part of its grandeur to the audacity of Hagia Sophia. Even the Ottoman conquerors, who converted Hagia Sophia into a mosque, could not escape its influence. The great mosques of Istanbul, the Blue Mosque, the Süleymaniye, carry the unmistakable imprint of Byzantine forms, their domes and semi-domes echoing the Christian basilicas they had supplanted. In art, too, the Byzantine vision lived on. Icons continued to be painted across the Orthodox world, following the same strict conventions that had been established centuries before. The stylized figures with elongated bodies, solemn faces, and wide, searching eyes remained central to Orthodox spirituality. But their influence did not stop there. Western painters of the Trecento, like Cimabue and Giotto, were deeply shaped by the icons and mosaics they encountered. Though they gradually moved toward naturalism and perspective, the luminous gold backgrounds and hieratic figures of Byzantine art left their imprint on early Renaissance painting. In Russia, the art of icons reached new heights under the brush of Andrei Rublev, whose famous Trinity icon distilled Byzantine tradition into a vision of serene, infinite communion. To this day, icons in Orthodox churches from Athens to Alaska preserve the unbroken line of this artistic inheritance. Literature, too, carries the afterlife of Byzantium. Chronicles, hagiographies, and theological treatises composed in the empire circulated long after its fall. The stories of saints, martyrs, and emperors became woven into the folklore of Orthodox peoples. In Serbia, Bulgaria, and Russia, Byzantine texts were copied into the Slavic tongues, ensuring that the empire's memory remained vibrant. Even in the Ottoman centuries, when Orthodox Christians lived under Islamic rule, these stories nourished their identity, reminding them of a glorious past and a faith that could not be extinguished. In this sense, Byzantium became less a political empire and more a cultural myth, a source of inspiration and endurance for subject peoples. There is a strange paradox in this afterlife. The very forces that destroyed Byzantium also helped to spread its cultural influence. The Crusaders, by sacking Constantinople, carried off treasures that revealed Byzantine sophistication to the West. The Ottomans, by conquering the city, absorbed its architectural genius and even its imperial ideology, with Mehmed II styling himself Caesar of Rome. The Slavic states, by inheriting orthodoxy, became new vessels for Byzantine culture. And the Renaissance, by welcoming refugee scholars, was nourished by Byzantine learning. It is as if Byzantium, in death, became even more widespread than in life. Its fragments carried far and wide, lodged in the cultural DNA of Europe, the Middle East, and beyond. Yet the afterlife of Byzantium is not only found in tangible objects or clear influences, it is also found in words and images that have shaped our imagination of empire itself. The very word Byzantine has become a metaphor, often misused, to describe complexity, intrigue, and decadence. Western historians of earlier centuries painted Byzantium as a stagnant, corrupt state, a foil against which the vigor of Western Europe could be contrasted. This was a distortion, but it was also testimony to how enduringly Byzantium haunted the European imagination. Even as it was maligned, it was remembered, and in more recent times, scholars have worked to correct the caricature, revealing instead a civilization of extraordinary resilience, creativity, and cultural vitality. Thus, Byzantium continues to live in our debates, in our attempts to understand the past, in the very language we use to describe politics and power. For the people who inherited its spiritual and cultural world, Byzantium was not a ghost, but a living presence. Russian Tsars crowned themselves with Byzantine rituals. Serbian rulers saw themselves as heirs to Constantinople. Greek poets and intellectuals in the centuries of Ottoman rule invoked Byzantium as a symbol of identity, a reminder of what had been lost and what might yet be reclaimed. In the 19th century, when the Greek War of Independence stirred, the memory of Byzantium, its emperors, its saints, its capital, was a powerful rallying cry. Even today, in modern Greece, the Byzantine double-headed eagle still flies above monasteries, and in Moscow, the Kremlin's domes shine with the inheritance of Byzantine architects. But perhaps the most profound aspect of Byzantium's cultural afterlife lies not in the echoes of empire but in the persistence of beauty. Walk into an Orthodox church anywhere in the world and light a candle. Hear the chant that rises, ancient and unaccompanied, in tones that would have been familiar to a citizen of Constantinople 1,000 years ago. Look at the icons, their faces serene and solemn, their eyes fixed on eternity. In that moment, you are standing within Byzantium. The empire lives not in marble walls or imperial titles, but in the living tradition of faith and beauty that it nurtured. Its afterlife is not a museum but a living liturgy, repeated week after week, year after year, across generations. So, let us linger a little longer in that afterlife. Imagine yourself in the quiet of a candlelit church, the fragrance of incense drifting upward. The icons glow faintly in the golden light, their eyes following you with unearthly calm. A choir begins to chant, the same words sung in Constantinople long ago. Holy God, holy mighty, holy immortal, have mercy on us. The music is slow, unhurried, stretching across time. In that sound, Byzantium is alive. In that beauty, its empire of the spirit continues. For though the walls fell, though the empire ended, the cultural afterlife of Byzantium still whispers, still sings, still shines in gold and song. And in that whisper, we realize the truth, that some empires do not die, they simply change form, becoming less visible yet more enduring. A soft, eternal presence woven into the world's memory, like a lullaby that never fades, carrying us gently toward rest. When Constantinople fell beneath the thunder of Ottoman cannons, and the cries of its defenders faded into silence, it might have seemed to those who survived that the world had reached its end. The last Roman emperor had vanished in the melee. The great church of Hagia Sophia had been claimed by a new faith, and the palaces of the Caesars stood broken and looted. Yet history is not an abrupt extinguishing, but a slow fading of embers, a transformation of light into memory. And Byzantium, the empire that called itself Rome, that sang hymns beneath golden domes and guarded the treasures of antiquity, did not truly end on that May morning in 1453. It slipped instead into the realm of echo, becoming part of the world's inheritance, whispering through centuries, shaping identities, inspiring dreams, and haunting the imagination of all who gazed upon its vanished glory. Imagine, if you will, the silence after the fall. The city, once filled with chants and the bustle of markets, was hushed, broken only by the caw of crows and the crackle of fires smoldering in ruined streets. Yet in that silence, a deeper resonance lingered. The stones of the Theodosian walls, scarred and blackened, still stood tall, as if to remind the conquerors that empires might fall but memory endures. The mosaics within Hagia Sophia still gleamed faintly beneath their hastily painted coverings, as though the saints, though hidden, continued to gaze upon the world with their unblinking eyes. The harbor of the Golden Horn, filled now with Ottoman ships, still mirrored the domes and minarets of a city reborn. Constantinople had changed rulers, but it had not ceased to be the meeting place of worlds, the bridge between continents, the eternal city on the Bosphorus. The Ottomans, in their victory, did not erase Byzantium. Mehmed II, the young conqueror, styled himself not only as Sultan, but as Caesar, claiming the mantle of Rome for his own dynasty. In the ceremonies of his court, in the architecture of his mosques, in the very administration of his empire, he drew upon Byzantine precedents. The Ottoman capital, Istanbul, became a city where Roman law, Greek scholarship, and Islamic learning mingled. In its streets, merchants still traded silks and spices, scholars still debated philosophy, and pilgrims still marveled at Hagia Sophia's soaring dome. Byzantium had passed into Ottoman hands, but its spirit infused its conquerors, shaping them as much as they had overthrown it. The afterlife of the empire was already beginning, woven into the fabric of its successor. But Byzantium's echo carried far beyond the Bosphorus. Across the Orthodox world, the fall was not seen as the end of faith but as a martyrdom. In the monasteries of Mount Athos, in the churches of Moscow and Kiev, in the chapels of Serbia and Bulgaria, the memory of Constantinople lived on as the lost queen of cities, the holy city betrayed but never forgotten. The cry of, "Better the Sultan's turban than the cardinal's hat," reflected a refusal to yield the Orthodox soul to Rome, even as its body fell under the Ottomans. In Russia, the Tsars began to speak of Moscow as the Third Rome, the rightful heir to Constantinople's mantle, the guardian of orthodoxy. The double-headed eagle of Byzantium, symbol of empire and faith, took flight again over Russian banners. In this way, Byzantium's soul was transplanted, living on in new lands and new empires, never wholly extinguished. Western Europe, too, felt the echo of ever-and Byzantium's fall. Shocked by the loss of Constantinople, they mourned the passing of the eastern bulwark that had long shielded Christendom from eastern invasions. Yet at the same time, they reaped an unexpected harvest. Refugee scholars, bearing precious manuscripts, fled to Italy, France, and beyond. They carried with them the wisdom of Plato and Aristotle, the tragedies of Sophocles, the histories of Thucydides, the science of Ptolemy. In their luggage was the spark of the Renaissance. Western Europe's rebirth of learning, its flowering of art and philosophy, owed much to the scribes and thinkers of Byzantium, who had preserved these treasures through centuries of war and turmoil. Thus, in dying, Byzantium sowed the seeds of another civilization's renewal. Imagine a scholar in Florence, bent over a newly arrived manuscript of Plato, his fingers trembling as he turns pages unseen in the West for centuries. Imagine an artist gazing at the luminous gold of a Byzantine icon, and carrying that sense of otherworldly light into the frescoes of the Italian Renaissance. Imagine a monk in Moscow chanting hymns written in Constantinople centuries before, his voice echoing through frosty air, carrying the cadences of Byzantium into the northern forests. In each of these, the empire breathes again, not as a state but as a presence. Even in the modern world, Byzantium lingers. Its name may conjure thoughts of complexity and intrigue, of politics as labyrinthine as a palace corridor. But scholars now remind us of its endurance, its brilliance, its role as preserver of the ancient world. The Hagia Sophia, standing yet again as a mosque, remains one of the world's wonders, a visible reminder that beauty can outlast conquest. The Orthodox liturgy, sung today in Athens, Sofia, Moscow, and New York, carries the same rhythms and words once heard in Constantinople. The domes and mosaics of Byzantine churches still gleam across the Balkans, Russia, and the Levant, each one a bold, living echo of a world that refused to vanish. And there are subtler echoes still. The concept of universal empire, of a ruler who is both temporal sovereign and spiritual guardian, continues to inspire and to warn. The dream of Rome of unity, order, and divine sanction haunts the corridors of power even today. The memory of Byzantium's fall, of walls breached by new technology, of a city betrayed by divisions within and without, remains a lesson on the fragility of even the mightiest states. History students still ask, was Byzantium doomed by its own intrigues, or by the sheer force of the Ottoman war machine? Was its faith, its strength, or its weakness? These questions linger, shaping how we think of politics, religion, and endurance. Yet perhaps the most lasting echo is not found in power or politics, but in the quiet persistence of beauty. Step into an Orthodox church at Vespers. The candles glow, the incense drifts upward, the choir sings in slow, haunting tones. The faces of the saints gaze from their icons, eyes wide with eternal calm. In that moment, you stand not only in the present but in the shadow of Byzantium. The same chants once echoed in Hagia Sophia, the same prayers once rose before the emperor's throne. Though the empire is gone, the song continues. And so long as it is sung, Byzantium lives. So let us close our long journey, this thousand-year story that began with Constantine founding a city on the Bosphorus and ended with another Constantine falling in its defense. We have walked with emperors and monks, with generals and scholars, with crusaders and conquerors. We have seen mosaics glow, walls crumble, armies clash, and prayers rise. And now, in the quiet of night, we listen to the echo of Byzantium, still faintly audible in the hum of history. Let it lull you as you rest. The whisper of waves against the walls of the Golden Horn, the solemn chanting beneath golden domes, the rustle of parchment in a scribe's hand, the distant bells, tolling for vespers. The empire is gone, but its memory is a lullaby, carrying us gently through the darkness. Byzantium sleeps, but its dreams are endless. And in those dreams we too may find rest, drifting on the tides of history wrapped in the soft cloak of an eternal city that still, in some secret way, endures.